Welcome back to the PFF NFL show. Trevor, Sikkema, Dalton, Wasserman here with you guys for a little bit of an off-season project here. The Super Bowl is in the rearview mirror. The 2024-2025 season is all wrapped up, which means, excuse me, it's time to get some off-season projects. It's time to talk about some AFC team needs. We got a handful of events through the NFL calendar that are coming up here. We got the Combine, which we're very excited about, of course, more of a draft focus. But then free agency's coming up in a couple of weeks as well. We really get to solidify some team needs. And Dalton, I feel as though, one, I'm very excited for this offseason with you because we were just talking about this off camera. You're somebody who loves the game of football. You love college football, obviously, with the college channel that you have with Max. And now it feels like you're getting to marry that together, and we get to hear your takes from college to the NFL in the form of the NFL draft. And you're already like, I feel like I'm going crazy sometimes with my draft takes here. And obviously, we're going to talk about some draft guys here on this show. But when it comes to free agency and establishing some team needs, that will give us a better idea of those draft prospects and those scouting reports that you're kind of building in your head that you might think you're taking crazy pills over, watching some other people. We get to kind of bring all that together here on a team needs show. So, buddy, how you doing? How you feeling? It feels like you had last week, when we logged on again, right before we hit record, you were like, I feel like I'm reading way too many draft takes right now. And I'm sorry to let you know that it's only the beginning. It's only February. It's going to be a long 2 months here for you. But how you doing, my friend?
Oh, fantastic. Look, Trev, everybody's got a right to their own opinion, and we all see the game differently, right? And I think as far as seeing team needs and where certain guys would match up, I think that's the first thing that any team has to do is lay out their offseason plan and figure out what they need, both on the field, on the sidelines, in the front office, right? We got teams at all different stages, and I think the goal is what you'd want to do is have an offseason like Howie Roseman and the Eagles did last year, right? Basically the perfect offseason, and then boom, you can get right into championship contention. So, I think it's always fun at this time of year, not only to just go, okay, these are the good players on the market or these are the good players in the draft, but I always love the team fit element to it of more specifically what that team needs and how it can help them more than any of the other 31 teams.
Yeah, so what we're going to do is we're going to divide the NFL in half as they do in the AFC and the NFC. Today we're going to talk about all of the AFC teams, and we're going to really establish some team needs, but we're going to give a lot more than that. We're going to talk about sort of what we think about the roster, what we watched last season. You mentioned, can we build like this Howie Roseman-like game plan for where it's perfect for some teams? Now, for some teams, that might mean, hey, we want them to go all in a little bit more. We feel like they're in a winning window. For other teams, it's okay. Well, they're seriously rebuilding. These are the types of players and positions that they need to go after. We'll do a lot of things here on the show. We'll talk about how much cap space every single team has. We'll talk about some pending free agents, but we'll also give you some free agent targets for them. We'll talk about some draft targets for them, and we'll do that division by division. And we will start with the AFC North here. Let's start with the Baltimore Ravens, okay? So the Ravens are a team, they've got an elite player at quarterback, right? And that's what everything kind of builds around. But Dalton, when you look at the Baltimore Ravens, this is sort of, what is this, like the third year in a row where it feels like it's been disappointing for this team in one way or another to at least not get to the Super Bowl. So this is one of those teams that would like that Howie Roseman type of an offseason to hit everything pretty perfectly for them. So I'll just start with team needs. I'll start with team needs before we get into specific targets of like players in the draft, players in free agency. When you looked at the Ravens, what was something that was holding them back a little bit from really getting to the Super Bowl and winning a Super Bowl this season?
Look, I mean, they don't have a ton of flaws, right? And that's kind of the beauty of their team is you've got an elite quarterback and a team that doesn't have a boatload of flaws where they, when you talk about them losing to Buffalo in the playoffs, it was really more about execution than it was about the talent level of their team, right? I think they definitely have enough talent to compete for a Super Bowl, but you look at them right now, and I think the first thing that stands out is that Ronnie Stanley and Patrick McCarry, their starting left tackle and left guard, are both free agents. And I think that's a part where as much as they want to run the football, and obviously for as long as Lamar Jackson often wants to hold the ball, pass protection is key. I think especially when you talk about Stanley, who's really been one of the best pass protectors of the last decade, that's going to be a key piece. I think there's going to be other teams, including other contenders, that are going to be looking at him for the pass blocking prowess. And, if they can't figure that out, that becomes an immediate need, I think, in the draft. So you look at left tackle and left guard on the offensive line. I think some help at cornerback would be ideal too, right? I think maybe to improve upon Brandon Stephens in that outside slot, or if they move Marlon Humphrey back outside, then you talk about maybe getting a legitimate nickel in there because he was kind of playing out of position. He was playing well, but he was playing out of position. And then the last thing I think, you think about Kyle Van Noy's a free agent too. We haven't seen the Eagles have an elite edge rusher in a long time. I think that's another one where, okay, they have some good players, right? Odafe Owe, David Ojabo's coming along, but finding one more of those just really good stand-up edge rushers that they like in that two-point stance. So I do think the challenge for the Ravens is that they don't have a ton of cap space and they have needs at a couple of really expensive spots, right? Think about O-line, edge rusher, cornerback. These are some of the more expensive things to acquire in free agency. So I think there could be a heavy draft focus if they can't keep one or two of these guys that they're losing to free agency.
Yeah, $2.9 million in effective cap space. We're using over the cap for this. And effective cap space, you'll hear me talk about that a lot here on this show and on the next show when we do NFC. Essentially, what effective cap space does is it gives you the projected cap space that you have overall this offseason, but then you have to build in your rookie draft class, right? I mean, like some people look at just the raw salary cap that they have available, and I'm just using a round number here. Maybe they'll go, oh, we have $10 million in free agency, so let's go get a free agent who's just going to cost us like $10 million. It's like, well, you have to think about you're going to have to sign your rookie class as well. So that's anywhere from like $6 to $9 million normally, depending on how big your draft class is. So that sort of goes into it, how many picks you have. So the effective cap space, which takes into account sort of an estimate of what it would take to sign an upcoming draft class for them, puts them at $2.9 million, and that's just 22nd in the NFL. So that's not a lot to work with. You mentioned key free agents. Ronnie Stanley's the big one. Patrick McCarry's another one. And then I think the other three that you have to talk about at least, what Marcus Williams and Brandon Stephens, and I think are the big ones, because when you look at those two guys, feels like Marcus Williams is out there. Ardarius Washington's also a free agent. I can't remember if he's a restricted free agent or not. I have to look that up in a second to make sure. But you go, okay, well, if you bring Brandon Stephens back, then are you probably not going to be able to bring Ardarius Washington back? If you bring in Ardarius Washington back, can you bring Brandon Stephens back? So it feels like there's going to be a little bit of a give and take because of how little salary cap money that they have there for them. When you look at sort of some projected free agents, obviously, like, we can't really shoot for the moon here with this team because they don't have a lot of cap space. But when you look at potential free agents or even the draft, do you have maybe a formula or say like, okay, I would like it if they'd go after this sort of a player or this position of free agency, and then this sort of player or free agent when it comes to the player or position when it comes to the draft?
So I think, first of all, you mentioned Ardarius Washington. He is a restricted free agent. And honestly, with the impact that he had down the stretch on their defense, I would prioritize him over Brandon Stephens, because once Washington got on the field, you could argue that him and Kyle Hamilton were the best pair of safeties in the league, really fixed that entire coverage unit, turned to 180 in the middle of the season, a lot because Washington got on the field as a starter and started playing well. I think the first thing I would look at in free agency is what would it take to re-sign Ronnie Stanley? I think that's a big thing. There's not really, other than maybe an Alaric Jackson from the Rams who's going to cost a lot, there's not really any franchise cornerstone kind of left tackles in free agency. That's the first place I would be looking, because I think that left tackle spot could really set them up. If they can re-sign Stanley, it could set them up to go elsewhere in the draft instead of maybe feeling like they have to take a tackle early, because it's not the deepest left tackle class, especially. We've got a lot of guys moving inside and some more questionable talents in the mid-rounds, but that's a spot I would go. If we're looking edge rusher on the free agent market, if he were willing to leave the Chargers, or if they could, I don't know what kind of bidding war it would take, but I think Khalil Mack could be a reasonable option for them, right? Even at his age, still playing fantastic football. And if you're looking at maybe moving Marlon Humphrey back outside, I think about a slot corner like a Mike Hilton from the Cincinnati Bengals, who would really fit into that aggressive style of defense the Ravens play. And then I look at the draft, and it all kind of builds from there, right? I think you think about, that left tackle spot. If they don't re-sign Stanley, then that's a spot I start thinking about with that late first-round pick. I think Josh Connerly Jr. from Oregon is a plug-and-play starter who can come in, at least give them solid pass protection as he continues to develop. But I do think think there's a pretty good chance he's going to be at least a B to B plus starter. If he ends up playing as well as Ronnie Stanley for a handful of years, then fantastic. But I think, the same idea with, say, a Tyler Booker on the inside. If you lose Patrick McCarry, you still need a left guard. I think Booker's a high floor starter that could be available at that spot. Jahdae Barron from Texas, you talk about either a zone outside corner if you're leaving Marlon Humphrey inside, or a guy who can move inside to the nickel himself like he did at Texas. I think Barron would be a great fit if he were to fall to them. And then if you were going edge rusher with that late first-round pick, I think Donovan Ezeraku, look, he's one of the best stand-up, two-point stance pass rushers in this draft. I think he would really fit in with that front seven, work into the rotation, especially on late down. So those are just, for me, the Ravens. The focus is really, it's kind of layered for them because to me it starts with Ronnie Stanley and whoever they're able to retain, and then it goes to that first round pick, and then they can build out the rest of the draft from there. So it's going to be kind of some layered decision making here for them.
Yeah, I love the suggestions that you made. Obviously, I think that Khalil Mack makes a ton of sense for them. I don't know if they can make it work numbers-wise. They'd have to have some cap wizardry, I think, to be able to get him on the team, especially if you're not sacrificing, like, all right, we're bringing in Khalil Mack, but we're also not signing Ronnie Stanley or Patrick McCarry or any of these cores. So if you want to bring in Khalil Mack, it's kind of a little bit of a give and take, but certainly I think that he would make a lot of sense for them. Love the Donovan Ezeraku call, and, when I think that it's a good call out by you. If they're going to stay with sort of the same scheme and they're going to have more of a cover three look to them, I think Will Johnson's an excellent cover three corner from Michigan, but he's not going to make it to them at the back end of the first round. And then you look at some other guys that we sort of like project as corners that could be late first, early second round guys. Trey Amos from Ole Miss, Siobhan Revelle from ECU. I like Darian Porter from Iowa State. You even go a little bit further. You even get into like second, third round guys like Maxwell Harrison from Kentucky, Azarie Thomas from Florida State. A lot of those dudes are like man coverage type of corners. They're not really those off coverage zone type of corners. So it's just something you got to think about there. I like the Donovan Ezeraku call. I think he'd be fantastic for the Baltimore Ravens. Another guy that I would shout out there is Kyle Kennard from South Carolina, because he's somebody who I think can rush from that 2-point stance as well. I think he can play in that outside linebacker spot too. So I think that's a good game plan for them. It makes a lot of sense, but I do agree with you. What happens on the offensive line is probably going to determine how they attack the NFL draft. So if they're able to bring Ryan Stanley back or what happens with Patrick McCarry, that's going to be probably their primary focus when it comes to the first round. Cincinnati Bengals. Bengals have $42.8 million in effective cap space. That is 10th in the NFL. So they have a good chunk of change to be able to work with here, but I think the looming part of this is T. Higgins is a free agent. Jamar Chase still has a deal that needs to be done. Trey Hendrickson was sort of unhappy with where the team was and probably wanting a new contract as well. There were some reports of that this past season. Key free agents for them, I mentioned Higgins is one, BJ Hill's another, Mike Hilton, who you talked about as a target for the Ravens, it's because he's a free agent there for the Bengals. Trent Brown's also a free agent. Akeem Davis-Gaither, so that maybe brings up a linebacker need for them. Mike Gesicki, we've talked about potentially a tight end landing spot for like a Tyler Warren or Colston Loveland. It's because he is a free agent, and they would probably want somebody who could really help them out in the passing game there at that position as well. But, Dalton, when you think about the Cincinnati Bengals, a lot of their struggles did come on that defensive side of the ball. Is that where you go for your team needs here with them?
Yeah, it's tough because you've got a team, and they still finished 9-8 this past season because obviously the quarterback and the receiving core is so good, but you've got needs all over the defense. They were near the bottom of the league again in safety rankings, and that's been a problem since Jesse Bates left. Defensive tackle's a major issue, and you just mentioned they're losing, the best of a rough bunch in B.J. Hill there if he leaves in free agency. The interior offensive line is a perpetual issue with them, even though they've spent a good amount of money on it in recent years. They have issues protecting Joe Burrow, and they're really just lucky that he can process the field so fast. And then I think obviously the biggest story, maybe the biggest story of all free agency is, can they find a way to keep T. Higgins, right? Can they find a way to, restructure some things and work the cap like Joe Burrow's been talking about some other teams can do? He's been kind of going scorched earth on it. Do they have it? Are they willing to do it? Are they willing to maybe restructure some things and keep T. Higgins? Because that really then throws wide receiver into the list of needs if he leaves, right? Because you're really just sitting there with Jamar Chase, and your third leading receiver, like you mentioned, Mike Gesicki. he was a free agent also. So you're talking really now about this team getting down to the bare bones at the moment of just being Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, and Trey Hendrickson, who you mentioned is unhappy with the contract. So there's a lot of needs the Bengals have. This is a really big offseason for them, and I think it does start with whether or not they can keep Higgins.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that Higgins, bringing him back makes the most sense for this team. Because of it's almost like they proved it this past year anyways. 9-8, still above 500, and this defense was terrible. I mean, you're hoping that they don't suffer as many injuries as they do next year that they had this year with some of those key players. You're hoping that you're getting better on the defensive line. There's no doubt about it. But the Bengals are in a situation where they're picking in the 20s. I believe they're picking 17th, and I think that you can still get an impact wide receiver at that spot. Like Matthew Golden, Luther Burden III could very well be available for them at number 17. And if you don't bring back T. Higgins, I just feel as though when I've mocked wide receiver to the Bengals, a lot of Bengals fans hate it. They go, no, like the defense is so bad. And it's like, if you guys lose T, Jermaine Burton did not turn out to be the steal that you thought that he was going to be. In fact, he was completely unreliable for you and wasn't even able to be on the field and dressed in certain situations. So, like, beyond him, are you really going to be able to go into next season with just Jamar Chase and Andre Yoshevich? Like, I cannot imagine that that's any sort of recipe for success, because the defense was also, it felt like, so devoid of talent last year that if you make a handful of additions to the defensive side of the football, but you lose T. Higgins, you're not really any better as a football team. Like, it would probably take both in order for you to get to where you want to go back into the playoffs next year. So I agree with you. I just think that re-signing T. Higgins is paramount for this football team, because whether or not you want to say, well, is it the biggest, is it the best use of resources because you know that you're going to have to pay Jamar Chase as well? If you don't sign T. Higgins, you better hope Luther Burden III is there at number 17, because if not, then I don't really know where else you go. Do you take a chance on like Stephon Diggs coming off of an ACL tear because you think he's going to be a little bit cheaper in price? You're going to get him for a discount because he's above 30 and he's coming off a major injury, but then that's a huge risk in and of itself. It's just it's hard to imagine the Bengals being as good as they want to be next year if they don't bring both of these wide receivers back, because they just don't have a lot of other talent. But what are some other names, some draft names, some free agent names that you got for this team?
So, I think, again, Higgins is going to be the big story when it comes to receiver in the free agent market. But I think otherwise this is a spot where you maybe try to find some value, right? They've got the 10th most effective cap space, but you still have to distribute it with so many needs, right? And maybe even take some chances. I think about, improving that safety spot. Maybe somebody like Julian Blackmon from the Colts who, we'll see with Al Golden coming in as their defensive coordinator, how much single high he's going to use. I don't know if it'll be quite as much, just press man and cover one like he did at Notre Dame, because that's pretty much all he had to use at Notre Dame to get to the national title game. But Julian Blackmon is someone at safety I would like for them. Poona Ford, the defensive tackle from the Chargers, one of the best run stoppers in the league this year for the Chargers. If they can get him maybe on a 1 or 2 year deal to fix up that run defense while they find other solutions. And then even on the offensive line, I would keep looking for interior help, right? Maybe you take a gamble on a guy going back to the Colts, actually, like Will Fries, who for the first 5-6 weeks this year before he had a big leg injury that took him out, he was one of the breakout stars in the NFL, playing like one of the best guards in football. If you can get him healthy and back in the starting lineup, maybe you got some potential there to get some value in a starting offensive lineman at the very least. And then I look at the draft, and you mentioned some of the round one options with wide receiver, but even if they decide to go defense, there's still some guys I think who could help them, say, on day two. I think about, we're going from one Higgins to another. I think about Iowa State wide receiver Jaden Higgins, who has very similar size to T. Higgins. Maybe he's not quite the athlete that T is, but Jaden's a really good possession receiver, works really well, had a perfect 99.9 intermediate receiving grade, which is honestly exactly where T. Higgins shines as well. So that could be somebody on day two as an option. You roll back to round one. I think about a guy like Walter Nolan, who had the second best run defense grade of all defensive tackles Bengals this year in college football to break out for Ole Miss. Same idea. Maybe Al Golden brings a Xavier Watts at safety. You know, he was this dynamite free safety who had all his interceptions at Notre Dame. He could bring him along just because he already knows him, and I think he would help that defense a lot. And then, again, I think about interior protection as an alternative to anybody in free agency. Somebody like Tate Ratledge from Georgia, who's a plus pass protector, could probably slot in at either guard spot if they want. We know with the Bengals, it's been a rotation for a long time at left guard between a lot of different players. And then on the other side at right guard, Alex Kappa didn't exactly have his best year. So I just think it's all the same needs here, and it depends on which road they want to go down. If they do sign T. Higgins, then you're talking about a route where they can really go heavy in the draft on defense, right? Walter Nolan and Xavier Watts round 1 and 2 would be something like an ideal situation, right? And we've talked about this is a draft where you can take multiple defensive linemen because it's such a deep class, even into rounds 4 and 5. So I don't think that'll be as big an issue. I'd still like to see them sign maybe 1 or 2 cheaper veterans in free agency, but the T. Higgins decision is really what's going to lay the groundwork for the rest of it.
Yeah, I like the Will Fry shout out. Maybe James Daniels as well. Played well, very small sample size before he gets hurt. But, like, again, something like that where they can get a couple of new bodies along the interior offensive line. They can make their splashes on the offensive side of the ball in free agency, and that frees you up to draft some really good players. If they don't hit offensive line in free agency, I like the idea of them taking one of these tackles and moving him inside. You know, we've seen sort of we have a long list, I think, of guys who played offensive tackle in college who are going to be kicking inside of the NFL. So, like Marcus Mbow from Purdue, Charles Grant, maybe from William & Mary, if you really believe in his talents and how well he played at William & Mary, if you think that's going to translate to the league. Was really impressed with Anthony Belton when he was at the Senior Bowl as somebody who played tackle at NC State, played really well at guard. Jalen Rivers from Miami, maybe a little bit further down in the mid-round. So those are some targets for them along the interior offensive line, because as much as we emphasize receiver, I do want to say the interior offensive line was not good enough to win football games last year, and I think that definitely showed. Burrow made up for a lot of it, but I think they definitely need to address that in a big way. So move on to the Cleveland Browns. Browns are in a very rough spot. I'm sorry to our producer Tyler, who is putting on this show. It was a big Browns fan. It's been a tough couple of years. I don't know if it gets better this offseason. I'm sorry, buddy. Negative $38.6 million effective cap space. That is 31st in the NFL. The only team that has a projected lower amount of effective cap space is the New Orleans Saints. Guys that you have coming up that are free agents, Jedrick Wills, Nick Chubb. I think the big one for them, though, is the fact that it's not just Jedrick Wills. Joel Bitonio, Wyatt Teller, Ethan Posick along the offensive line as well are free agents next year. And all of them are above the age of 30. Jack Conklin's a free agent the year after, but his contract is sort of flexible to where, like, he's one of the guys that you're throwing out there of, like, okay, do you have to cut Jack Conklin just to make the cap room to be able to trade Myles Garrett if a Myles Garrett trade is going to happen here for this team? Because remember, it's not like it's a lot of cap relief. Well, it's not any cap relief at all for this team if they trade Myles Garrett, and Myles Garrett has already said that he wants out. If they trade him, it's another $36 million on the cap. And so they've got a lot of reasons to not trade Myles Garrett. Financially is one of them, but if he is disgruntled and he's pissed off and he doesn't want to play for you, he might be forcing their hand anyway. So the Myles Garrett situation has to play out. There's no doubt about it. And then sort of what they're even going to do to get cap compliant, and then sort of what their roster looks like after that. So, you know, we always talk about the caveat of, oh, hold on, team needs, we got to get the free agency, we got to see what they're going to do in free agency before we get to like draft needs and things like that. We got to see what the Browns are even going to do before the new league year opens up, and they can get closer to where they need to be cap compliant. But when you look at this team, a little bit independent of sort of what I just talked about there, roster-wise, what are the team needs for this team to play a lot better in 2025?
I mean, the first thing they do need to do is trade Myles Garrett. I know it's a lot of money, but you're essentially buying whatever draft picks you get out of that. And then I've told you before, I think I would trade down from that number 2 overall slot. I don't think that for all the needs you just mentioned, because the first thing I wrote down here for their needs was everything on offense, just everything. They were the lowest graded offense in football this past year, and there just doesn't seem to be any long-term hope. You even mentioned all those offensive linemen. it's one of the older offensive lines in the league. This was going to naturally erode anyway. They built it for a couple of playoff runs that they did have, and now all those guys are getting older, and pass protection's an issue, and pretty much everything aside from Jerry Jeudy is a massive question mark on this offense right now. So I look at that, and then if you look at the defensive side of the ball, I think some more interior pass rush and another corner alongside Denzel Ward who can play in man coverage, right? You saw a lot of struggles last year from Martin Emerson and Greg Newsome because they play so much cover one in this defense under Jim Schwartz. And, Ward had 17 pass breakups, but the rest of the unit really struggled at corner. So it's like you mentioned, it's going to be tough for them in free agency to find legitimate options. They're going to have to really nail this draft and probably one or two more just to get themselves back relevant with where their roster is at.
Yeah, and sort of like I was talking about when we were going over this for the Ravens, there's a lot of decent man coverage option corners that this team has. So if they want to stay aggressive with it and they want to get a corner, sometime on day 2, if they trade back from pick number 2, the further you trade back, obviously, the more you're going to get in return. A guy like Darian Porter, a guy like Maxwell Harrison, a guy like Azareye'h Thomas, like those corners that are in the draft are man coverage type of corners, and I think it could be a lot of fun for this team. Maybe the standout that we had from the Shrine Bowl, Kobe Bryant, he's somebody that you maybe could draft in the early parts of days 3. So I think that he's somebody that you could also shout out there for corner. But any dynamic answer in the run game, any sort of offensive lineman that they can get in the farm system, even for a year, maybe it's an interior offensive lineman behind the guys that they have there. And, if they can't bring those guys back, if they retire, if they're going to other teams, you got somebody in waiting, and it's not a terrible situation there. I like the Paulson Adebo call out that you had sort of on the sheet here as a potential free agent option. Hard for them to really go after and sign these guys, though. So Cleveland, it's just tough because until we know what happens with Myles Garrett, because of how much that means against their salary cap, and then just even independent of that, getting above the salary cap floor, that's the important part of this team. But just so much on offense. They need another receiver. They need a dynamic player in the run game. They obviously need a quarterback as well. And quarterback, the guy who's on the roster, is a big reason why they are so hamstrung and why Myles Garrett wants out. So that's sort of a story in and of itself. So it's tough. I don't really have a lot of suggestions for Cleveland because I'm not a cap guru who knows how to work all of this myself. And so when I look at Cleveland, it's hard to not think, and I see some people in the chat saying this, like, you basically have to forget about 2025 and 2026. Like, you basically just have to take it on the chin that you signed Deshaun Watson and you made one of the worst trades in sports history. You kind of have to just work through that, and you have to hope that your team looks completely different in 2026 and 2027. It's hard for me to give Browns fans much hope outside of that, outside of Deshaun is your quarterback next year, maybe even if he's coming back from the Achilles injury, which maybe he's not. And like maybe they're going to play better, but it's just there's so many layers to the Browns that I hate being this negative about it. I just don't know where they go. I don't know where they go other than the number one thing they can do this offseason is, like you mentioned, trade down from number 2. And I'm talking about you should trade down from number 2. Sometimes you talk about, well, you want to trade down from the top 3, but you don't want to get too far down because you still want to get a good player. At this point, screw that. Go from 2 to 23. I don't care. Get multiple first-round picks, get multiple second-round picks over the next couple of drafts, because to me, that's how you actually get this team to where you want to go. So I think that trading that number 2 overall pick is probably their best move there to attack all those team needs. Last team in the AFC North is the Pittsburgh Steelers. Steelers have a lot of cap space, $50.1 million in effective cap space. That's the 8th most in the NFL. James Daniels, a free agent. Russ, Justin Fields, those are the big ones. Sort of what decision are you making there? Najee Harris, also a free agent. But an interesting one for me is Nate Herbig. Maybe him hitting the market. Maybe less so for the Pittsburgh Steelers because it feels like they got a lot of pass rushers there, but he's more of an underrated one that you look at for other teams, and you talk about a situational pass rusher who's had some really good games this past season and over the last couple of years. He's somebody to keep an eye on. Dante Jackson, also a free agent. Preston Smith, 33, 34 years old. He's also a free agent. What's Pittsburgh's biggest team needs here, Dalton?
I think the biggest problem is that we have no idea what the future looks like at quarterback, right? You mentioned Wilson and Fields, both free agents, and Russell Wilson seems to have a desire to come back. The team seems to have a desire for Justin Fields to come back as well. It seems like they want to run it back with the same crew. The question is whether or not they're how much they're willing to pay for both of those guys, right? They got Russell Wilson on $1 million deal last year, and he was one of the biggest bargains in football, right? Despite the way that it ended, he played really well considering he was making $1 million from them and the rest of his money from Denver. So we really don't know what their quarterback situation looks like, right? And even in the entire backfield, Najee Harris being a free agent, they need kind of an early down back. I know Jalen Warren's good. He's very efficient, but he can't be the only guy in your backfield. And then in the passing game, I look at they just don't have enough at receiver, right? George Pickens is a really good deep threat, but they don't have a guy who gives them a lot of yards after the catch. That's something I would be looking for, too. Somebody who can take those shorter targets and create explosive plays out of them. And then the one big problem on what's generally a really good defense is that cornerback spot, right? We know Joey Porter Jr.'s got potential, and he's not quite grading as high as you think he might because, the lack of ball production, but they need somebody on the other side at corner who can be productive for them because, honestly, it was a black hole last year. Teams figured out as long as you get rid of the ball quickly and get rid of it to the outside, you're not going to have a whole lot of issues dealing with this pass rush because you can protect yourself, and these corners can't cover one-on-one. So I think you have a lot of needs on offense, and then you have one big one on defense that they need to figure out.
The chat correctly correcting me. It's Nate Herbig, this free agent from the Pittsburgh Steelers, not Nick Herbig. So sorry about that. Thanks, chat, for keeping me in line there. Just wanted to make sure that we reiterated that. I'm looking at your free agent list here for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Love Luther Burden for them. If they can get another dynamic wide receiver there, I think that makes a ton of sense. Love Damian Martinez as well. Like, he's somebody who's very intriguing to me. He really productive year this past year when he was at Miami. Just a bigger back, somebody who it feels like the size-speed combination the Pittsburgh Steelers always gravitate towards. I was worried about sort of what he was going to be able to give you on third down when I was watching him at Miami, but he felt like he was a lot more focused, a lot more motivated to be a better pass catcher, better pass protector when I was watching him in Mobile. So that was a good sign that that's still there with him because he is a bigger back and he's alluring for those reasons. Getting a corner like Siobhan Ravel, I think makes a ton of sense for this team. Joey Porter Jr. has really struggled so far. So even though you know that they're not going to move on from him, can he man those CB1 duties for you moving forward? I'm not so sure that you just want to go into next year and say, like, oh, yeah, we're going to be good. JPJ is going to be fantastic in that area. I think adding another corner, I think, could definitely make sense. I like who we have on this list as well with Carlton Davis III. If he hits free agency, I think that he could make a ton of sense for the way that they played coverage last season as well. Anybody else that you want to shout out here before we move on?
No, I think just to expand on Martinez a bit, one of the comps that actually Max Chadwick has been throwing at me the last couple weeks at him, and he's like, he's kind of got that James Conner feel to him, right? He's big, he's 230 pounds, pretty easily projectable as an early down back, and I think somebody would be really not fun to tackle in the cold weather. He just kind of, the more I thought about this, and I'm like, well, I'm picking and prodding with all these running backs in this loaded class that we have, and I'm like, who fits in where, right? Who needs what exact skill? Because there's so many different types of backs too. And I look at, in the past, they've had James Conner, you think about Najee Harris the last few years, they've always had that bigger back who can just lean forward and keep your offense on schedule. And Martinez felt like that guy for me. So I think definitely a mid-round target for them.
All right, that's everybody in the AFC North. Before we move on to the next division here at the AFC, question for everybody who's watching, listening. What's your child's success look like to you? Is it maybe a job that they're very passionate about? Maybe it's traveling the world. Maybe it's just a life that is just happy, comfortable for them to live by, whatever that is. You can help them achieve that, whatever their dreams are, big or small, with a kid's investment account from Fabric by Gerber Life. By making a contribution to your child's future today, you can help give them the means to pursue whatever those dreams are. Fabric by Gerber Life was designed by parents for parents to make it easy to plan for and manage your family's financial path. With a kid's investment account from Fabric, you can start investing in your child's future today. The whole thing is online, very easy to set up. It could take you as little as just 5 minutes, and then you can manage your child's account, monitor those investments right from your phone. Starts with just $20, no contribution limits, tax advantages, funds are SIPC insured up to $500,000, no commission fee, just a low flat monthly maintenance fee. Used for basically anything. When they're younger, tuition, tutors, music classes, sporting events, whatever. And then when they're adults, first car, first house, starting a business, or just whatever allows them to live that life comfortably that they dreamed of. Join the thousands of parents who trust Fabric to help protect their family. Start investing in your child's future today at meetfabric.com/PFFNFL. That's meetfabric.com/PFFNFL, MEET, fabric.com/PFFNFL. Portfolios are managed by Fort Washington Investment Advisors Incorporated. Additional services provided by Apex Clearing Corporation. All investing is subject to risk. Learn more at meetfabric.com. To go to the AFC South now for our next division here. We're establishing some team needs, pre-free agency, of course, for all these teams here in the AFC. Houston Texans. Right around where the cap floor is. They're a little bit in the red. Negative 2.9 effective cap space is 23rd in the NFL. That's something that it's not too difficult to really get cap compliant there, and they'll probably have an opportunity to go out and make a little bit of splashes here and there. Maybe not the biggest splash, but pending free agents that they have. Eric Murray, their safety, he played a lot of snaps for them this past season. Stephon Diggs coming off the ACL tear, but he was scheduled to be a free agent this offseason as well. Robert Woods, so the veteran depth piece of the wide receiver room, also hitting free agency. Foley Fudukasi, Derek Barnett, Dario Ogunbowale, their third down back there, Neville Hewitt as well. So you get a couple of players that Stephon Diggs, definitely a big one for them, but a lot of depth players that could also mean a lot towards this team, depending on whether or not they bring them back and how it could look a little bit different for them. What's some team needs that you have here for the Houston Texans, Dalton?
Yeah, this is one of the easier ones because the first thing that stands out to you is the interior on both sides of the ball, right? Interior pass protection for C.J. Stroud needs to be the number one priority here. You saw that, especially in games against better defenses or even in the playoff game when they just couldn't block really any of the blitz packages they were getting, or they couldn't figure out how to block Chris Jones. They're just not good enough, especially on the inside right now, to pass protect at a Super Bowl caliber level, right? So I think that's going to be the first thing, is protecting C.J. Stroud. And then on the other side of the ball, they need run stoppers, right? I think this team, when they get ahead of you and they can really pin their ears back and just play pass defense, you've got an elite edge rushing duo, you got great corners on the outside. You don't want to throw the ball into the teeth of this defense, but you can run on them right now, right? So I think defensive tackle, to me, is a spot where they're in the bottom 5 of run defense grade, and they need to get a lot better, and they're going to have a lot of options. Again, I keep saying it. It's a loaded defensive line class, and there's a boatload of run stoppers. I think this draft class is really going to work to the Texans' advantage, especially you've mentioned them as a trade-down candidate from the first round before. They could really build that depth that you're talking about on the defensive line. And then the other question is, okay, who do we have at receiver right now other than Nico Collins? I think they need more of that movable chess piece receiver that Stephon Diggs was supposed to give them before his injury, right? And now you have Tank Dell with another big injury. So I think you're talking about, you mentioned depth. That's really the key here, right? Depth on the interior, the offensive line, depth at defensive tackle, and then depth behind Nico Collins at receiver. He's one of the best receivers in football, but you can't just have one threat and expect to really contend for a championship. So that's the biggest question for me. I think Stephon Diggs, like you mentioned, is an interesting name, and I think you mentioned, considering the cap space situation, they're going to be looking to find some value at very specific spots on this team that won't be at the top of the market, but they can still improve.
When I think about defensive tackles or run stuffers, yeah, I mean, they could potentially pick a guy like a Walter Nolan from Ole Miss in the first round. They're picking pick number 25 right now. Kenneth Grant from Michigan, Tyleek Williams from Ohio State. I think all those guys make sense for the Houston Texans, but honestly, I would wait if I were them. I would wait until at least their second round pick, because they only have 6 picks, but they have a first rounder, a second rounder, a third rounder, a fourth rounder. They have Buffalo's 5th rounder. Don't have one in the 6th, but then they do have one in the 7th. So it's one less than if they were just scheduled to have their regular 7, but it's still okay for them. I would wait. I'd be waiting if I were them, because you get a little bit further down the draft, and you've got guys like Tim Smith from Alabama, Zeke Biggers from Georgia Tech, Cameron Jackson from Florida, Jamari Caldwell from Oregon. There's just a lot of J.J. Pegues, maybe Jordan Phillips from Maryland. Like, there's a lot of guys that you can get later on that interior defensive line. So if I'm the Texans, I'm more prioritizing, okay, do you need that secondary receiver with Nico Collins? Like, do you have a chance to pick a Matthew Golden from Texas and Emeka Egbuka from Ohio State? Like, those two guys, maybe even a Luther Burden if Luther Burden makes it to you at number 25. I would think about that at one of those spots. Or is one of those offensive tackles who you think are probably going to kick inside to interior, or is one of those guys available? Like Gray Zabel from North Dakota State, is he going to be available for you? I don't think Armand Membu is going to be there from Missouri, but sometimes he's had a late first round projection, so maybe he's a player there. Donovan Jackson from Ohio State, somebody who I think could be a big difference maker there for them along the interior offensive line to really hit that biggest possible need. That's where I'd go in terms of a draft strategy. What do you think?
I agree. I think it makes a lot of sense with the amount of run stuffers that there are in this draft. I think a receiver, Ibuka would fit really well in kind of what Stephon Diggs' role was supposed to be, just a guy you can motion all around the formation and really do anything. He's a very willing blocker too. He can help your run game. And I think you mentioned all those run stuffers, and a guy in the second round I could see them going after is Alfred Collins from right down the road in Texas. And I think the big appeal with Collins for me is the number of different alignments that you can put him in, right? Like some of those guys you mentioned, they're just one techniques. They're just going to plug up the A gap, right? Or maybe they're just three technique penetrators. Collins can do it all. He can allow you to mix up your fronts, and you can really build your whole run defense around him. So I think the fact that he's a more movable piece is why he's someone who's higher on the list than some of those other guys you mentioned. But like you said, this team, they need to be able to protect C.J. Stroud. They need to be able to run and stop the run. And certainly for stopping the run, they've got a lot of options. So I get not going unless there's a premier talent that they feel like is higher on their board than their pick. I get not going defense in the first round, because at the end of the day, if this team's going to win a Super Bowl, they're going to do it around C.J. Stroud, right? You need to make that your biggest priority.
I would agree. Indianapolis Colts here. Colts have 24.3 effective cap space. That's 18th most in the NFL. Some pending free agents that they have: Ryan Kelly, their starting center, Mo Alley Cox, starting tight end, EJ Speed, starting linebacker for them, Deo Odeyingbo, a rotational starting defensive lineman, Julian Blackmon, who we've talked about here already on this show as a potential guy who could move in free agency. Their safety there, Will Fries, who's having a really good season before he went out with injury. Joe Flacco as well. It's worth pointing out that he is a free agent, because you got to talk about sort of quarterback position. And all right, maybe they're not going to be the starter over Anthony Richardson to start the season. How long is the leash here for Anthony Richardson in the year 2025? So I think those are things that you have to talk about here. And Dalton, what are some team needs that you have for this team as it stands right now?
So it sure seems like they're going to bring in at least some sort of competition, right, for Richardson. And I don't think it's at the level of Sam Darnold, who's going to be probably the highest paid free agent quarterback this offseason. But, this is the one spot where I have thought about, despite all of the other stuff, and there's a lot to put up with for sure, and it'll be a whole circus, but this is the one spot where I still think actually that Aaron Rodgers might be able to go and play well. If he were to, I don't know if he'd be named the starter right away, if he's going to play over Richardson, or if they would compete, or how that would work. But you look at the way this offense is set up. You've got a good offensive line. You've got Michael Pittman and Josh Downs and Alec Pierce outside. You still have Jonathan Taylor in the backfield. I mean, there's a lot going here, plus a really good play caller in Shane Steichen, aside from tight end, because that's really the one big weakness on offense, and there's a guy in the draft that we might get to if they drop to his spot. But, I think about in free agency, Aaron Rodgers might be someone they think about. Maybe a Kirk Cousins is somebody they think about. It feels like they would bring in one of those one-year veterans, I think, that can just come in and functionally run the offense, because that's really the biggest problem with Richardson is the lack of footwork and the lack of accuracy. They just don't get enough first downs, right? And I get the home run balls are great, but you have to be able to move the chains, right? We've seen that. Look, Philadelphia was like that. Kansas City made a Super Bowl doing that again this year, of just get first downs by any means necessary, and that's what this offense is designed to do. And then I think some more pass rush depth, right? You mentioned Odeyingbo's a free agent. They drafted Leatu Latu last year, but Kwity Paye hasn't really become the star that they wanted him to be. I think a little more help off the edge would help them and just get the rotation going before, hopefully, obviously for them, Latu turns into a star and they can build behind him, but they need a little more from that four-man rush.
You've got Kyle McCord here on the sheet as a guy who they could also look at quarterback, if they don't do anything in the pro market. I like that. I also like, who else I like for this team as a quarterback, if you sort of get into the mid rounds and he's available early day 3, whatever it is? Dylan Gabriel from Oregon. I think that some people look at this situation with the Colts and they'll go, well, okay, well, if you got Richardson, just draft draft Jalen Milroe, right? I mean, it's sort of the same thing, sort of the same archetype. Like, okay, well, if Richardson's not good enough, you could take a chance on Milroe, and it's sort of the same offense. It's built around a dual threat quarterback. Or you could say, all right, we'll take Riley Leonard, right? Sort of the same thing, like a guy who's got that dual threat ability to him. I would almost go the opposite, not the complete polar opposite, but I would rather a Kyle McCord or a Dylan Gabriel be the young rookie backup to Anthony Richardson, because kind of exactly what you said with Aaron Rodgers. Now, the Rodgers element of it is very interesting, because I also agree with you. I think Indianapolis would be a great landing spot for Aaron Rodgers. Would Aaron Rodgers go to a situation where he basically does not have the ability to start right out of the gate? Like, there's not really a quarterback competition to be had. They're going to let Richardson start next season. Because if that's the scenario, let's say this is like the best case scenario for Rodgers, right? And it's like, okay, well, you kind of got to sign here. Would he just retire then at that point? Would he just say, no, okay, I'm not going to put up with that. I'm going to be done. Because if he's not, then I do agree with you. I actually like this spot for Rodgers. But I think it's more unlikely than it is likely that he would land in Indianapolis. And instead, if you're drafting something, go draft a quarterback who knows how to operate from the pocket. Like, can you imagine Dylan Gabriel? I know it's very different going from Anthony Richardson to Dylan Gabriel, but Gabriel, like you said, get a good offensive line in front of you, got a good run game, in theory, got good offensive weapons to throw the ball to. Gabriel knows how to play quarterback. You could plop him into the NFL, and like, I don't think he's going to look super overwhelmed. Is he going to be chucking the ball 40, 50, 60 yards down the field all the time? No, but he's going to be able to sort of West Coast this offense a little bit down the field because of the playmakers that they already have at some really great positions. So I like the Aaron Rodgers thought, and my head actually goes to, if they aren't able to do that, getting a quarterback who's of that mold. What do you think for that team?
Yeah, no, I think, what I was looking at as far as the draft guys is that Shane Steichen's offense is very RPO heavy. So I was kind of looking at which guys in this class ran the same kind of offense, whether it be this year or throughout their careers in college football. So McCord was one. They ran him at a very high rate at Syracuse. Gabriel's always run him wherever he's been. Curtis Rourke from Indiana was another guy I think could get into this offense and function reasonably well and just do the things that Shane Steichen tells him to. It's not the most complicated offense. They need to be able to execute, and they want to play it fast. So I think any of those guys could be an option. And I don't think this is a team that would go early in the draft, right, in the first two rounds at quarterback, because they still believe there's something obviously there with Richardson. But those guys as options in rounds maybe 4, 5, 6, I think it absolutely makes sense. You just keep taking swings at guys. And look, we've seen it with other teams, right? You take swings at, at depth at quarterback. If you think a guy is good enough to be on your roster, go ahead and take him. It's how the Niners ended up with Brock Purdy, right? It's how the Eagles even ended up with Jalen Hurts, even though that was in round 2. If you feel like that player fits and you can make him into something, you take him. So I do think maybe even early on day 3, any of those guys could be options. And then the one other thing I want to talk about here, with their first round pick, man, Trev, if Tyler Warren's on the board at 14,
well, that's his floor.
That's the floor. We're starting to think he could go in the top 10. But if he ever got there, or if they ever decided they were trading up for a guy like that, boy, he would be a perfect fit. I felt it with Brock Bowers last year, and he just didn't quite fall to them, and I feel the same way with Tyler Warren this year. This offense with a tight end that can make things happen after the catch would be absolutely nasty. It would be almost hard for Richardson to fail at that point if all those receivers were in and Tyler Warren was in there too. So, I think that's a guy that would be a prime target for me in round 1. But otherwise, they do have options when you talk about the secondary, the defensive line they could still go after. I think they're another team that could dip into this running back class to get some depth going. So they have options, but I keep thinking about that. I'm like, if Tyler Warren ever fell to 14, they would be living.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything you said there. I am curious as to whether or not they would believe enough in Colston Loveland to also say, yeah, we take him at 14. I don't know. Maybe that would be the case. I'm not sure they love him enough at 14 to make that happen, but perhaps they looked at the success that Brock Bowers sort of had as that slot receiver, tight end type of a player to make it happen. One other thing before we move on. The chat, people in the chat are saying this, and I'm not trying to say that you're wrong here. There's a lot of people who said it. Shoot, I feel like maybe I've even said this before, but the idea of, well, they got to go get a tight end because then Richardson has no excuses. If that's sort of your line of thinking, Richardson already doesn't have any excuses. He's got all the receivers that he would want to have. He has Jonathan Taylor. He has a great offense in front of him. It's not like if he failed this past year, like let's say the Colts drafted, I don't know, somebody else on defense who would be pass rusher. Let's say they drafted Mike Green. All right, I'm just throwing out a name, right? They draft defense in the first round. They don't get Colston Loveland. They don't get Tyler Warren. If Anthony Richardson struggles this past year, it's not like anybody's going to say, well, he didn't have a tight end. You know, there's too much evidence now to where it's all on him anyways. It doesn't even really matter. A tight end would be great for this team. Not trying to say don't draft a tight end, but I'm saying the Richardson part of this equation is basically independent of any offensive player that they would draft. Because if this is your franchise caliber type of quarterback, look at the offense that the Colts have. It's a pretty dang good offense that at most quarterbacks in the NFL, really all quarterbacks in the NFL that are starting caliber players should be able to operate under. So for AR, it's basically all him at this point. Let's move on to Jacksonville. The Jacksonville Jaguars, 24.6 effective cap space. It's 17th most in the NFL. So basically the same situation that the Colts are in. They're free agents. Brandon Scherff's a free agent along the offensive line. Mac Jones, backup quarterback there for them. Andre Sisco, I think that's a big one. How much did they believe in Andre Sisco as their safety moving forward? Enough to give him that big contract there. And then you get some depth guys, Jeremiah Ledbetter, Luke Farrell, like some players like that. But the big ones, I think, are Brandon Scherff and Andre Sisco and kind of what happens there with them. But they'll be looking to make some additions, some signings elsewhere in the pro market, and then make some splashes in the draft as well. Team needs for the Jags. What do you got?
I think you mentioned it. It's a lot like Houston, where they need to fix up this interior to protect Trevor Lawrence, right? That's really been the issue for the last year and a half. It's just not enough pass protection for him, and we've seen it with injuries on multiple fronts here. You know, we saw it, I believe it was a leg injury in 2023. This year it took off scrambling and got the concussion and had a shoulder issue. So they need to protect Trevor Lawrence. I mean, you have weapons on the outside that can succeed, especially Brian Thomas Jr., but if your quarterback's not protected, you really can't get anywhere. Safety, like you mentioned, that's somewhere they have to get better. Now, I do think they weren't coached all that well in the secondary this year, but, you know, between the lack of talent at safety and then the lack of execution from the unit as a whole, that's somewhere they can improve. And then, you know, I think something people have been talking about a lot, especially when it comes to that 5th overall pick, is an impact two-way defensive tackle that can change the look of their front seven. They're pretty set at linebacker. They're pretty set on the edge, but in the middle of their defense, especially in run defense, there's just not a whole lot going there for them. So I think there's some fixable spots for them, right? And I think about finding starting caliber players in these spots. You look at free agency. I think somebody like Justin Reed from Kansas City could be a plug-and-play starter for them who could really improve them. Just functionally, one of those players who's so fundamentally sound. If they wanted to get top of market in free agency instead of the draft for a defensive tackle, you could be looking at the Eagles' Milton Williams, who obviously just had a huge year and had a really big Super Bowl. And even going to the Eagles again there, if you wanted a guard, there's major issues for this team, especially at right guard. I think Mekhi Becton is someone who had a bounce back year this year. Really good run blocker, could fit in with some of Liam Cohen's run schemes. I think that's a spot where if they want to run the football and they want to get better on the interior on both sides of the ball, Becton and Williams, they could look to Philly, and what better place to look, right, when you're looking for trench help. But, you know, and then again, the talk has been in the draft, Mason Graham maybe with that 5th overall pick, right? He's been the best defensive tackle in college football the last 2 years. Really, it feels to me like arguably the safest pick in the draft. And again, positions of emphasis I'm looking at. The center, Jared Wilson from Georgia, I think is actually going to be an excellent player. I think, Trevor, he could sneak into round 2. I think right now he's the most polished center in this draft. And then Andrew Makuba from Texas at safety, again, fundamentally sound, really good tackler, had a breakout at Texas, really played well in a heavy zone scheme and was asked to kind of be the captain of that secondary. So I think there's a lot of players in this draft and even in free agency that can help this Jags team get better pretty quick. I don't think they're that far off when you look at being, okay, maybe a wild card contending team, right? This is not a team completely devoid of talent, but just the last year and a half, it felt like the morale was shot and they weren't coached very well this past season.
Yeah, Ladarian, I see the super chat. I'm going to get to that in a second. We're going to kind of finish out talking about the Jags, and then I'll get back to the super chat. So I want to know that is coming. You know, I think that you are right that the reason why we've been so frustrated with things in Jacksonville is because we don't think they're that far away from really competing. And it feels as though it's like, all right, well, one step forward, one step back, one step forward, one step back, another step back, 2 steps forward. And so it's just they can't really take that leap to being one of the powerhouse teams in the AFC, and maybe they'll have the chance to, as some of these teams who are obviously riding high right now, maybe they'll just have their waves and go through a little bit of a valley here, and maybe Jacksonville could time it right and be one of those teams that's hitting their peak at the right time. I think they need to get better along the interior offensive line. I agree with you. I think Jared Wilson is big for this team. Morris has not been what you wanted him to be with consistency and impact play, so getting Wilson, I think, makes a ton of sense for them. Somewhere on day 2, I agree with you. He is. Now, I don't know if he's one of the most polished centers in the class. One, there's not a lot of great interior offensive linemen, so I guess the bar is a little bit lower this year than it is in years past. So that sort of goes into it. But he is at least a great athlete. He's the type of player that you would really want to invest in the center position. So I do like that. The center from Georgia, like that idea there. Obviously, Mason Graham's a great idea there for them. I don't think they'll spend money on the defensive line because Arik Armstead's already making a good chunk of change for them. Josh Hines-Allen is as well. Trayvon Walker's a free agent next year. You've got Armstead on the books for another, I think, 2 years, and then he's a free agent in next offseason. So if they're going to go with an impactful defensive lineman, I do think it's going to be from the draft, and I do like the Mason Graham call out there. He's my favorite pick for them at number 5, so I think that one makes the most sense. I think if you're going to invest some capital in something, it's going to be the offensive line. It's going to be that interior offensive line, whether you're trading Sheriff out for something else or you're just drafting another defensive line, interior offensive lineman somewhere on day 2 to really compete for one of those starting spots, or maybe both. I think that could be a something that you could bring up there as well, making sure that the offensive line is what it needs to be for their new offense coordinator Liam Cohen. Anybody else that you would want to bring to the table as a suggestion for this team? We're moving on.
I think in the draft too, the other spot maybe we look at is corner. If for any reason, say, at the very top, if Travis Hunter were to fall to 5, I think that's an easy pick for them as well. But I think we'll see them looking at cornerback, get somebody across from Tyson Campbell on the other side as well. That might be if Hunter's not there on the board at 5, and maybe they go with Will Johnson, but I think they would go with Graham over Johnson. Then you start looking. I think on day 2, corner might be an emphasis too.
Ooh, Brian's saying Will Campbell at 5, better choice than Mason Graham at 5.
Are we moving him inside in that spot? Is that what's happening?
Yeah, I think that we would be moving him inside. I love me some Will Campbell, but I can't subscribe to that. I'm a big Mason Graham guy. I think he's going to be one of the best players from this draft. Going back to Indianapolis right now, I think that we go back to some Indianapolis things I've seen in the chat. One, Tom said, love the idea of drafting a quote-unquote young backup in Dylan Gabriel for Indianapolis, even though he's 2 years older than Anthony Richardson. That's a fair point, Tom. That's a fair point that you make there. That's a good call out there by you. And then Ladarian gives a super chat a little bit earlier, said, what about trading Michael Pittman and the 14th overall pick to Carolina to move up to number 8? So it's a 6-position pick swap there. You're trading Michael Pittman because I think the thought process there is like, all right, well, you got A.D. Mitchell, you have Alec Pierce, you have Josh Downs. You might be able to go up and get Tyler Warren, although it's kind of funny because if you're trading up to 8 in that scenario, you're still 1 pick behind the Jets, who are becoming a popular mock draft destination spot for a Tyler Warren. Right off the top of my head, I don't think they do that. One, because what you're giving up in Michael Pittman doesn't get you as high as you would want in the order. Like you're going to number 8 and you're getting in the top 10, and to me, like, that's nice. Obviously, you'll have some better players to choose from, but the gap between 8 and 14 and the player that you might have to choose versus how good Michael Pittman Jr. is, I don't think that would, like, if you actually wanted to make that deal with Carolina specifically, you'd also have to get something more back, in my opinion, from Carolina. Carolina would be having to give you something back to get Michael Pittman Jr. So I understand, hey, Carolina needs a wide receiver, one type of a player. We could give them that. We can make a pick swap, but I think they would get even more from Carolina in that scenario. What do you think?
No, I agree. I think if you were going to involve Pittman in a trade, you would then maybe do something drastic like get into the top 5, and maybe if they were feeling like turning over completely a new leaf at quarterback, which is unlikely, or trying to get an elite talent, say like Travis Hunter, like even a Mason Graham, or get ahead, like you mentioned, of the Jets and Tyler Warren. I think if you're going to trade Pittman, it's further up than 8. You're making a drastic move at that point.
The Tennessee Titans, the next team that we're talking about here to round out the AFC South. Titans have 35.7 in effective cap space coming up for free agency. That's 13th in the NFL. A couple of key free agents here for them. Dylan Radins, Tyler Boyd, Nick Westbrook-Akine, the touchdown monster, Daniel Brunskill, Jerome Baker, Sebastian Joseph Day, Darrell Baker Jr., the cornerback. So they've got a handful of guys that I think offensive line is a big priority for them. I don't want to sort of steal your thunder when I ask you about some team needs, but Dylan Radins being on that list certainly goes into that. Daniel Brunskill being on that list certainly goes into that. Making some changes along the offensive line. You've got some potential wide receiver moves as well, right? You moved on from DeAndre Hopkins in the middle of the season last year. Now you got Tyler Boyd and Nick Westbrook-Akine, who are both free agents as well. Oh my goodness, that Treylon Burks has not, sorry, I forgot his name for a second, has not developed the way that you would want him to. Your thoughts on this team overall, some team needs for them?
Look, I think we're going to know very soon how their entire offseason is going to play out based on how free agency goes. Because right now, it feels like there's no way they can walk into next year with their current quarterback situation, right? So the decision is going to be, do they go and sign somebody functional like a Sam Darnold and then build a team around him in this year's draft? Or do they figure out some other options? Do they get better off the edge? Do they get better at receiver in free agency? Another team that you go, okay, T. Higgins is kind of on the list here, and I think that's why T. Higgins is such a big story in free agency is because the number of teams where he would fit in and improve that situation, right? I think Tennessee is another one. Do they want to go that route and spend their money on the rest of the roster kind of like they did last year and then wait and then by the end of March, if not earlier, we're going to know whether or not they're taking a quarterback number one overall, right? I just don't think it's feasible at all that they could walk into next year with Will Levis as their starter, as their only option, right? So, quarterback, the right side of their offensive line needs work. They need help at receiver, especially after trading DeAndre Hopkins. I know they have Calvin Ridley, but they need more than that. And then, I think some help off the edge. They had the highest graded group of defensive tackles in the league last year with Jeffrey Simmons and T'Vondre Sweat leading the way with that. But they need some real juice off the edge as a pass rusher. So, I think somebody like Josh Sweat in free agency could be a target for them. I wouldn't be shocked to see them get kind of towards the top of the market for edge defenders. But they have a lot in this team that they need. I mean, obviously, and it starts with the quarterback spot, and that's really going to be the first domino to fall.
I like the Josh Sweat call-out. I hadn't thought of that before. That one makes a ton of sense for me. Team's got money to spend. Josh Sweat, obviously great in the Super Bowl. I like that for them.
They just need anything off the – I mean, you really look at their pass rush and what they didn't get off of the edge this past year. They need anything. It would be a substantial improvement. Even if he's not, say, a Parsons or a Garrett or somebody like that, it would be a massive improvement considering what they've been running out there.
We will – I think that what you said at the beginning is totally correct with the Titans. We will know whether they're drafting a quarterback at 1 or an edge rusher at 1 in – 3 weeks or whenever free agency is. If they make a big splash at edge rusher, they're obviously honing in a quarterback at the very top of the draft. If they go sign or trade for a big name quarterback, could very well be taking Abdul Carter at number 1. Shoot, I mean, we could even throw in Travis Hunter at number 1 as well. I don't want to say that's not a factor, but I feel as though we're going towards 2 paths here, taking Abdul Carter, taking Cam Ward, or I guess the third path would be if you feel good about it and you got a great trade down option, you're trading down as well. But I think wide receiver is kind of independent of either of those. I think you're looking to make a big splash anyways. You mentioned a T. Higgins, a Chris Godwin, maybe somebody like that. Going after one of those wide receivers that might be available around the league, to me, that could make sense. Maybe this is a destination for a Cooper Kupp type of a player. I think that making a wide receiver splash is independent of whether they're going edge rusher or quarterback at number 1 there. So that's sort of my thought with the Titans as well. I think that offensive line, to me, also has to be a major talking point here. You play J.C. Latham at the left side of the line of scrimmage next to Peter Skoronski. Does a situation present itself where you can draft a left tackle? Maybe you could trade down, draft a left tackle, move J.C. Latham back to right, if you're comfortable with that, if you think that's the best case scenario, or maybe you have the chance to draft an Armand Membu and he can play right tackle for you anyways, and you can keep J.C. Latham at left, whatever it is. The offensive line was as much as quarterback play was not good enough in Tennessee last year, the offensive line was also not good enough, and I think the receiving corps got to get better too. So, anything else here before the Titans? Before I go to the chat, because we got some questions here.
No, I think that's just why I threw a couple of day 2 options in there that I think could really help them. You talk about somebody like TCU's Jack Bash at receiver that they could get early in the second round. I think would be a really good fit for them and a good complement to Calvin Ridley. And then if they were going to leave Latham at left tackle, then I think somewhere on day 2 you think about maybe a starting right tackle, somebody like Ozzie Trapilo from Boston College, who to me I think is actually a pretty easily projectable starter. Maybe not an all-pro player, but I think he could start at right tackle for them immediately and be an improvement.
I agree, man. Ozzie is somebody who I think is going really underrated on this offensive line class, so I like that. David in the chat, going back to Indianapolis when we were talking about Dillon Gabriel, says, so last mock draft, they were destroying Gabriel for his age and the fact that he can't see over the offensive line. Today, he's a great rookie backup fit. What's going on with that? So, look, I think it just depends on how you look at it, right? Some people talk about Dillon Gabriel as if he's a top 50 pick. I think that probably when you guys were doing whatever mock draft you were doing, can't remember if he's referencing a full first-round mock or if it's one of those team-centric mocks that you and Max have been doing. Dillon Gabriel, I wasn't saying draft Dillon Gabriel and then like you're drafting him in the second round or the first round or something like that. I'm talking about drafting him in the early parts of day 3. Like you're drafting him to be a backup quarterback in the NFL. And he's got physical limitations that would probably be a reason why he's not a long-term starter for you. But as a backup, I think he's perfect because of exactly who he is. Dillon Gabriel, again, sort of going back to what we were talking about when we were going over Indianapolis things. If you plop Dillon Gabriel in the NFL right now, he's not going to look like a lost puppy. You know, he understands how to run offenses. He understands how to go through progressions. He knows how to read defenses. Now, is the NFL timing there for him? No, he hasn't played it down yet in the league. But that's why I love Dillon Gabriel as a backup quarterback in the NFL, because he's not somebody that you have to, take your time with and teach the game to. Like, he knows it very well. So do I think he can be a long-term starter in this league? No, probably not, because of the physical limitations that David's probably referencing here that you guys talked about on a previous episode. But in terms of hey, if Richardson kind of struggles anywhere from the mid parts of the season to like week 14, something like that, and you go, we gotta put somebody in here. We gotta give somebody a chance to show our offense some more life, be a little bit more consistent for us. Dillon Gabriel can be that. I'm not afraid to say that for a short amount of time. So any thoughts on that, Dalton, before we move on?
No, I think you have a lot of quarterbacks, and we've mentioned a handful of them today in this draft that go squarely in the functional backup category. Gabriel, Riley Leonard, Kyle McCord, Curtis Rourke. There's probably guys I'm missing. There's so many. Max Brosmer I think about too. Guys who can come in and function, right? And there is value to that, right? And you mentioned it. None of them. I don't think any of them are going to be franchise guys. But when you're talking about taking quarterbacks in round 4 and beyond, yeah, that's what you're talking about. Is most of the time that's going to be your backup, and hopefully you develop him into something at least useful and a guy who can function for a handful of weeks. If he turns into anything beyond that, that's really a bonus. But you're talking about at least a half dozen guys in this class that are squarely in the functional backup bucket.
Yep, I agree. Moving on to the AFC, so we'll start with the Buffalo Bills, a team that is, again, like we've talked about with a couple other teams, right there, just needing to get over the hump. What can they do this offseason to be able to do so? Negative $17.2 million effective cap space. That is 30th in the NFL. So they've got to do some things to get cap compliant here when the new league year rolls around. Pending free agents, Amari Cooper, who was a great addition for the team, but he's a free agent, so they got to decide what they want to do with Amari Cooper. Rasul Douglas, Mac Hollins, who, man, it kind of looked like Mac Hollins when they went into Kansas City. He was one of the only ones who wasn't afraid the second the ball was snapped, like at the beginning of the game. And so you could say to yourself, okay, well, they don't need Mac Hollins. They can move on from him. Him having that sort of mentality in a big game, tough to move on from players like that, especially when you want to be playing in those big games more moving forward and extend your season a little bit further. Austin Johnson, Quentin Jefferson, Ty Johnson, Dwayne Smoot. These are some other guys that are some pending free agents for them here. Buffalo Bills team needs what they can do this offseason, Dalton. What do you got?
I mean, to me, it's just all about their defense, Trevor, at 99% of this, because you just can't have a bottom 5 graded defense and the second worst coverage grade in the league and expect to win a Super Bowl, even for as great as Josh Allen is and for as much as he can carry on offense, both with his arm and his legs. They have to get substantially better on defense, and it can't just be, bend but don't break, but, we lead the league in takeaways. Well, in between all those takeaways, you're giving up a boatload of points. So I think at every level of their defense, they need to get better. They need run-stopping defensive tackles. They were not great inside this year. Their linebackers had the worst coverage grade in the league by far. It was a struggle for them in open space. And then they just need more talent at cornerback, right? You're talking about Rasul Douglas being a free agent. Christian Benford's a good player. Taron Johnson's been productive a lot for them in the slot, but they don't have a whole lot of depth. You've mentioned this before. When Benford was out in the postseason and Kyer Elam came on the field, they just had no answers, right? And they had no answers over the middle, too, because they didn't have linebackers who could cover. So at all three levels of their defense, they have to get better if they're going to go into Kansas City and win an AFC title. If they're going to beat, Baltimore again in a big spot, right? Because they didn't even really make stops in that game. It's just the Ravens kind of beat themselves and dropped the ball and fumbled the ball. And then you talk about, say, having to play a team like a Philadelphia, right? Or even a Detroit. Say if they get to a Super Bowl, got to be able to make stops. And this team, to me, the overarching theme, despite all the discourse everyone wants to have about Josh Allen, is that the last 4 years, the Bills have not made stops when they have needed to make them in the postseason. And that's the reason they haven't won a Super Bowl yet, is that this defense hasn't been good enough. So I think you're in another offseason, maybe more than ever, where they need to get better at all three levels on defense.
I'm with you, man. I remember doing some mock draft exercises a couple of months ago. And to be fair, we were still in the season. And I had cornerback as a spot for the Buffalo Bills to look at in the first round of the upcoming NFL draft. And a lot of Bills fans are like, no, wait, don't need corner. Not a corner for them in the first round. I think this is absolutely a first round need for them. Depending on what happens with Rasul Douglas. If Rasul Douglas doesn't come back, they absolutely have a open cornerback spot. Kyer Elam, at this point in time, you cannot look as lost as Kyer Elam did against the Kansas City Chiefs. Again, you could say to yourself, I mean, it's the Chiefs, it was in Kansas City. Those are the games you're trying to play. You have to have players on your roster to be able to be up for those types of games. And Elam very clearly was not. He was playing way too soft in coverage. He was not aggressive. He was not confident. That was your moment. That was your time. And he just absolutely was not. So I would not depend on Kyer Elam at all as a starting corner for you moving forward. If you want to keep him on the roster, continue to try to develop him, fine. But I'm making moves at corner. There's no doubt about it. And if they don't bring back Rasul Douglas, you're basically saying we're drafting a corner in the first round. Maxwell Harrison could be an option for you. I like Darian Porter from Iowa State. I think he makes a ton of sense for this team. You mentioned Trey Amos from Ole Miss. I like that as well. I think any of those guys are better starting options for them than what they currently have opposite Benford. So to me, at corner and interior defensive line is great, but we already talked about earlier in the show, you can draft really good interior defensive linemen, especially the run stuff and kind of interior defensive linemen a little bit later in this draft. So I'm coming back around to corner being probably my top target here for the Buffalo Bills.
Yeah, no, I get it totally. I mean, you could think about if there's a guy they like enough, in that late first-round pick on the defensive line, but that's going to be, I think you're going to see that as part of the draft day decisions for a lot of these teams is, look, there's a ton of depth at D-line. There's a little bit less depth at corner. We need to get a premier player at that spot now, and we can figure it out later. You mentioned guys like Jamari Caldwell, or I think about a C.J. West from Indiana, who I think would fit in here. I think it is going to work into a lot of these teams' decision-making. So it's kind of odd when you go, okay, wow, this defensive line class is so talented, and yet it's contrary to what you might think about teams grabbing all these guys early as well. There's still a lot of them. We'll get them later. The Bills might be in that spot, and again, another team that could take multiple guys. You could see them round 3 and 4, round 3 and 5, just go, look, we have to build the depth of this thing. We just don't have enough talented guys in here. So I'm with you. I think it makes a lot of sense to go corner first and then build that D-line depth throughout a really deep class.
Some guys that might be a little bit, later for them at corner. Noel Williams from Cal. Thought he had a really great Shrine Bowl. Think he'd be a good choice for them. Zy Alexander from LSU, who I think could really be a good man coverage type of a player for you. Quincy Riley had a really nice day 3 in particular in Mobile at the Senior Bowl, so that was fun to watch him play really well. O'Donnell Fortune from South Carolina. These are just a handful of names that, if they want to double dip at corner, or even if they don't hit corner at the top, they can really think about it as these guys that can play man coverage for you on the outside. Miami Dolphins, next team that I want to bring to the table here. Negative $13.7 million in effective cap space. That's 27th in the NFL. The Dolphins are kind of in a tough spot here, Dalton, because they're pretty top heavy with a lot of their contracts, and they still were not a good football team this year. Now, injuries certainly go into that. I want to say that they had a bad luck year when it came to some injuries. But Javon Holland, Terrell Dodson, Kendall Lamb, Liam Eichenberg, Kendall Fuller, Emmanuel Ogba, Calais Campbell, Jordan Poyer. Does Teron Armstead retire? He's been in and out of the lineup. Kader Kohu's a restricted free agent, so they're probably not losing him. But Deshaun Hand, Anthony Walker Jr., these are contributing players for you. And you're not even cap compliant right now. Your roster is so top heavy, and you're going through a lot of injuries with those guys, so that makes sort of their projection a little bit more difficult moving forward. You want to have more depth on the team because of those injuries and make sure that you're giving yourself sort of an insurance policy with them if they continue to hamper through injuries, or maybe they're not the same player when they return. But Miami does not have a lot of flexibility. It feels like a lot of Miami's chips are kind of like on the table right now, and they just need to be a lot healthier next year and play better than they did this past season, because I don't know how much flexibility the Dolphins really have to change their roster a lot this year for the better, but some team needs for this team. What are you looking at here with the Dolphins?
I think, look, they still need to get better in pass protection on the inside. They have issues at guard. They're going to have to find probably two starting guards, because you've got guys between injuries and free agents. Like Eichenberg played a lot for them this past year. I think it was Robert Jones playing left guard. I believe he's a free agent also. They need answers at guard, especially with Tua as the quarterback, and he's kind of injury prone and not moving around back there a whole lot. So if they don't have interior pass protection, they're going to have another tough year. You mentioned safety with Javon Holland leaving, linebacker with Anthony Walker leaving. They have Jordan Brooks, but they really don't have a second one right now. There's a lot of spots on this team where you go, okay, they got to fill in the blanks. You mentioned it. They just cut Kendall Fuller too. They struggled in the secondary last year. They're going to need another corner. Kader Kohu's okay in the slot, but he's a restricted free agent. Who knows if they'll keep him or not. He's kind of expendable. So you're looking at a secondary that just has Jalen Ramsey, an offensive line that really doesn't have any starting guards right now, and you need another linebacker and a very injury-prone edge defender group that, right now, Chop Robinson walked in this past year as their best pass rusher because they had so many injuries, and this talented guys there. Obviously, Jalen Phillips, Bradley Chubb, but we don't know their injury situations heading into next year, so they could still need help on the defensive line. And Calais Campbell, you mentioned, he was their highest-graded run defender, so they're really losing a lot, and they don't have a ton of resources to replace all this. And then there is questions about Teron Armstead between a huge contract that he has. He's got a massive cap hit next year that he could be expendable, or if he retires, he's had some injuries in the past too. There's a lot of issues for this Dolphins team right now. I know they're loaded at some of the skill spots, but they've had problems on defense all season, and their pass protection on the inside especially is not good enough right now.
Yeah, Robert Jones is another player who, along their interior offensive line, who I didn't mention, who is also an unrestricted free agent. So I think that you've got to look at them really nailing it in the first round. And it's hard for me, as much as I think Malachi Starks makes sense for this team, the safety from Georgia, especially if you lose Javon Holland. It's hard for me to look at them taking the number, 13 overall? Where are they? They're right outside. I think it's 13. It's hard for me to see them taking the number 13 overall pick and not investing it in the offensive line when you don't even know if Teron Armstead is going to be there. And if he is, how dependable is he at this point in time, at his age and his injury history, right? And so there's just not a lot along the offensive line for them to hang their hat on. So I almost feel as though we're locking into offensive line there no matter what. Armand Membu, Will Campbell if he's there, Kelvin Banks Jr. if he is there, right? Like that's where my mind goes to with the Miami Dolphins, because I agree. I think offensive line is just paramount for this team to invest in, and that they don't have a lot of capital to go out and sign one of these big-time difference-making offensive linemen at tackle or at guard. So I know they've got Brewer there on the team, and he's got to continue to play a little bit more consistently for them at the center spot, and he can. But that's my thought process for them. I think a lot of the other needs are secondary needs beyond that offensive line. Like I know you listed Aaron Banks as a potential fit. I think he'd be a great fit for them, Aaron Banks, if he's leaving San Francisco. But I don't know if they're going to be able to even spend the money to go out and get Aaron Banks. I think it's more of just something that they've got to invest along the offensive line. And shoot, even if they were to go get a player like Banks or somebody else, an interior offensive lineman, I feel like we're locking into an O-lineman at 13 no matter what.
Yeah, I agree. Look, I'll be honest with you, for them or even for San Francisco at 11 with the system that they run, that Shanahan wide zone scheme, if Kelvin Banks were on the board, I would sprint the card in. I think that would be the absolute best pick they could make, and especially that's one, if Armstead is out, I would almost think about moving up to get Kelvin Banks. As you've got, to me, I think he's going to stay at left tackle. I think he's a really good pass protector, and he fits perfectly in that run scheme. If Armstead stays, then I start thinking about Membu and going, okay, does he move inside now, because you still have Austin Jackson there at right tackle. I think Membu in this scheme at right guard would fit in really well. So I think those are two guys that I'd really lock in on with experience in similar schemes at Texas and at Missouri, both really strong pass protectors. I think those are the two guys. And I would say the same thing eventually when we get to San Francisco, because they run obviously the same run schemes and everything like that. I think Banks and Membu are the two guys I would target early. And then later on, maybe I think about safety. I think about maybe one more receiver, somebody in the slot. I know they have Malik Washington too, who they started to get going the second half of last year. And then you can find linebackers in the mid-rounds. But I'm with you. Offensive line at 13 almost has to be the case.
Yep. Going back to the chat, David's asking, does Dylan Gabriel fit Miami scheme if Tua were to go down again? I think so.
Yeah.
I think Dylan Gabriel will be a great backup quarterback for Miami. And you get to stick with the lefty.
I was going to say, they're pretty similar.
Right, and your starter and your backup guy, sort of how you want to get the ball out of their hands very quickly, like what Mike McDaniel wants to do. Like Dylan Gabriel gives you the ability to do that. And again, it's not like, oh, this guy's a righty versus a lefty, he can't play on our team, like we're not going to get him on the roster. But it is nice if you have a lefty quarterback starter to then also have, as a bonus perk, the guy who fits your system is also a lefty behind him, because then all of the receivers, whether you're working with the first team or the second team in practice, you know how the ball is spinning when it's coming towards you, you know where it's coming from. Like, it's just, it does make it a little bit easier. So not that that's the most important thing, but I think that the parallels sort of do make sense for those two guys.
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree. I think you're talking about, too, even just the style of quarterback, whether it's left or right-handed or not, a guy who wants to get rid of the football quickly, again, run a lot of those RPOs that Mike McDaniel wants to run, and just complete passes, right? It's kind of what we talked about with the Colts. It's just eventually you just need a guy who can complete passes, see a defense quickly, process it quickly, and get it there accurately. And I do think Gabriel and Tua do have kind of similar skill sets on that front. I think Tua's arm talent is still a little bit better than Gabriel. Maybe Gabriel can move a little better at this point in his career, can give you something in the bootleg game, but I think it is a good offense for him to go in and run. New
York Jets. Actually, no, we're doing the Patriots first. We're doing the Jets last in this division. Sorry, reading the sheet a little bit wrong. Doing the Patriots, the team we're talking about first. An exciting team here for this exercise because they are first in the NFL in effective cap space, $111.9 million in effective cap space. So the good news the bad news is, I'll give you the bad news first. This is the worst roster in the NFL. The good news is you got a really high draft pick and you got a lot of money to change it. So, with that being the case, looking at a couple of free agents that they have here. Jonathan Jones starting outside corner. He's a free agent. Dietrich Wise, an impactful, sort of rotational, versatile defensive lineman for them. Also a free agent. Austin Hooper's a free agent. Their backup quarterback, Jacoby Brissett's a free agent. Not so sure Brissett's going to be a priority here for them with Drake May, but obviously they can bring him back because he knows the system if that's something that Brissett wants to do. Overall, some team needs here for them as they have a lot of money to spend in free agency and some good draft picks as well. Dalton, what do you got?
Look, the other bit of good news there is they at least know who their quarterback is, right? Unlike, say, a team like Cleveland or Tennessee. We know Drake May is the quarterback. They just need to surround him with basically everything else on offense, right? This was one of the worst pass-protecting teams in the league. This team had, just didn't have the young receivers step up this past season, so they just need to surround Drake May with talent. That's going to be the entire idea. So I think about them working at the top of the market in free agency with all that cap space. Are they a team that's going to win the bidding war for T. Higgins? Are they a team that could go get Trey Smith inside from Kansas City? Could they go get Alaric Jackson, who had a breakout season at left tackle for the Rams? I think those are the type of players they're looking for. There's not a ton of young foundational players in this year's free agent class, but the few that there are, I think New England has to be in on all of them, right? They just have to spend this money. They have to surround Drake May and raise the floor of this offense first and foremost. They need a little bit more at edge rusher. They need another corner across from Christian Gonzalez. But if you don't build this thing around Drake May, both through free agency and through the draft, then it's really all for naught, right? And I think even though Mike Vrabel wants to build a complete football team, you have to build it around Drake May first and foremost. So to me, they're going to be in on every big name, especially on the offensive side of the ball in free agency, and then we're going to see what their draft decisions look like after that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's just going to be offense heavy for this team, and they really need that. I love the addition of that you're suggesting of them making a big swing at T. Higgins. I love the thought process of them shooting for the stars with a guy like Trey Smith, guy like Alaric Jackson, like basically just the top overall options, right? I mean, is this a team where if Ronnie Stanley doesn't go back to the Baltimore Ravens, are the Patriots a team that's like, hey, we got money to burn? Fine. You played a full season last year. We'll believe in you. We'll give you a couple of year deal and pay you top of the market money, whatever it is. And so do you bring in a Ronnie Stanley and then all of a sudden like, okay, well, you're bringing in a couple of starting caliber offensive linemen that frees you up at number 4 to take a Tetairoa McMillan, Travis Hunter if he's there, even a little bit later in the draft if you wanted to go wide receiver, although they have Jalen Polk and Javon Baker in it. You really just need those guys to play better no matter what. So just wherever they get to that level, you've got to improve the pass catching in the room, and those two guys absolutely have to step up. That's one of the most disappointing things about this entire team is drafting both those guys and both of them being complete duds. Now, you're hoping that with Mike Vrabel there, new coaching staff there, it's totally going to look different because very clearly the coaching staff under Gerard Mayo was not working last year. I'm not saying that he totally deserved to be fired after 1 year. I think there's a lot of layers into that situation. But no matter how you look at it, the coaching staff on New England was not doing enough, even with a lower tiered roster. They were not elevating the floor of that roster at all whatsoever. And I think that Vrabel is one of those coaches that does give you the ability to do that. So I like that idea. I like that game plan. You just got to go over offense as heavily as you can. New York Jets is the next team. $11.1 million in effective cap space is 21st in the NFL. Although they have a little bit of flexibility here with some of the guys that are probably going to be in and out of the lineup here. As we go over the next couple of weeks. Free agents, Aaron Rodgers, we know that he's not going to be part of the team anymore. You could probably throw Devontae Adams in there as well. He's not a free agent, but he's somebody who's not going to be on the team, we don't think, since Aaron Rodgers is no longer going to be a part of the New York Jets. Tyron Smith, Morgan Moses, Hassan Reddick, Javon Kinlaw, DJ Reed, Tyler Conklin, Jamian Sherwood, Chuck Clark, all of these guys pending free agents here for this team. Dalton, what is their priority here? What are their biggest team needs in New York?
Okay, well, the obvious one, as it always is, as it's been since Joe Namath, is they need a franchise quarterback, right? So, and I don't know that they'll be able to get one unless they really, really want to. And I think that is the first conversation that needs to be had. When we talk about Cleveland with that second pick, right, and all the trade down scenarios, I think the Jets are possibly at the very top of the list of teams that could think about doing that if they like Shedeur Sanders or Cam Ward enough, right? I think at what point do they get gutsy and just go, look, we have to just go all in on one guy? And I know, look, they took Zach Wilson with the second overall pick. They couldn't make it work. They never really had any pass protection for him either. But do they get gutsy and think about, okay, go up to the second overall pick? Or if one of those guys falls a little more naturally, do they just move up 2 spots, maybe to 5, to get ahead of the Raiders and beat them to the punch there? I think free agency is going to tell us a lot. Maybe not about the Jets signing someone like Sam Darnold or something like that, because I don't think he would come back. But what are some of these other teams' decisions? Or the Jets, are they content to sit there at 7 in the draft and take either, if a quarterback falls to them, or take a Tyler Warren, or take a defensive player that falls to them, a Will Johnson? They're going to need another corner across from Sauce Gardner. It doesn't sound like DJ Reed's coming back either. Do they need another weapon on offense? Is it maybe a Tetairoa McMillan? Because I think when you're talking about Devontae Adams, if he's going to stay, he has to restructure. He's got a massive cap hit that they just can't deal with. They've got to clear cap space with him, whether it's cutting him or restructuring it. But, I think there are a lot of obvious needs here. Again, quarterback, tight end. They had the 3rd lowest graded group of tight ends last year. Tyler Warren is a popular pick at 7. That would fit. Defensive tackle, they need run stoppers on the inside too. I know I've said that a lot with a lot of these teams, but it was a real issue last year with the way their defensive line eroded, and they had some injuries on the edge too. And then in the secondary, filling in around Sauce Gardner, because they've been very mediocre at safety now for a couple years, and finding a number 2 corner, somebody to replace DJ Reed. So part of all those decisions on defense are going to go into how Steve Wilks and Aaron Glenn are going to run this defense. But the first question, as always, that has to be answered here is, who's throwing the football? I mean, are they content to walk into next year with Tyrod Taylor? Is it going to be some other veteran to come in and compete with him? There's been talk maybe even about Kirk Cousins, or are they going to get gutsy and trade up in the draft and something we might not see until draft night? Well, I'm curious to see with them more than anything what their evaluation of this quarterback class is, and if they feel the need to push it, and if they feel like one of those guys is really their guy.
I don't think they're going to do it with quarterback this year. I don't. Because and the reason why I say that is because they sort of already had one. And whatever you want to think about Rodgers, I just keep going back to what Aaron Glenn said when he was asked about Aaron Rodgers right after he got hired, and he said us bringing Rodgers back as it is less to do with Rodgers, and it's more to do with where we think our roster is going to be. And with them moving on from Rodgers, I think they probably figure that they're also moving on from Devontae Adams. Like, I think they look at this roster, and I think Aaron Glenn went, we are not ready. Like, these are not the guys that are going to be able to play my scheme, that I feel like are my type of culture fit players. And I just can't see them moving on from a lot of draft picks to trade up from number 7 to go get a quarterback. I just don't think they're going to do it. Not that your idea is wrong. I think that you're correctly pointing out this is a scenario for them. I just don't think it's likely, because I don't think this team's in a position to move on from draft picks that are Aaron Glenn specific players that he's going to be able to draft. I don't think that they're going to want to do that there. So I think this is a team that's much more comfortably going to sit at number 7, more likely to trade back than they are to trade up. And I think that also the Tyler Warren pick makes sense for them at number 7, not just because the Jets didn't have good play from their tight ends, but also because he feels like he could be an Aaron Glenn culture fit. And if we're being completely honest about this whole exercise, the team needs or position targets for the Jets, the only thing that we really should be writing here is Aaron Glenn players. I don't know what that looks like yet because he hasn't been a head coach, but that's basically it. Whether it's a running back, whether it's a tight end, whether it's a punter. Obviously, they're not going to draft the punter at number 7, but you guys know what I'm saying. The positional importance value part of this, I'm not going to say we're like throwing it to the wayside, but it is more important to get the right players right now for the Jets than it is anything else. Trying to fit like, oh, well, we need this very bad. I think the Jets are more than content saying to themselves, we're going to sign a veteran quarterback somewhere, whether it's Russ, Kirk Cousins, whatever it is. We're going to sign a veteran quarterback for the next 2 years, okay? We're going to build the roster because they're probably doing some future scouting as well. And next year's quarterback class, not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but like, okay, Arch Manning's in it. You know college better than I do. Like, who? It's kind of like Arch Manning, and then sure, somebody could emerge. Garrett Nussmeier.
Garrett Nussmeier. Carson Beck is still, he's got one more year. He's going down to Miami. There's certainly probably a greater amount of options. There's a lot of wait-and-see guys, that we have to really evaluate during this season. I don't think there's anybody surefire. Obviously, Manning's assumed because, well, he's a Manning, right, and he showed you a bit last year. But, no, I think the Rodgers thing, too, as far as the decision to keep him or not, like you mentioned, if we talked about this offseason, the Jets have to fix the culture and the leadership of this team first before we even really think about how this team is getting put together. So I think that's really Glenn's focus in his first year, just like it was for Dan Campbell in his first year in Detroit. Look, this is how we want to play football. So to your point, not forcing a quarterback makes sense. Get more guys at more positions that fit what you want to do, what Glenn wants to do, what Steve Wilkes wants to do, what Tanner Engstrand wants to do on offense, right? And really build it the way they want to build it with that sort of vision. And then if they don't feel like one of these quarterbacks fits that vision, because look, from his angle, he's going to treat every position the same, right? And I know you want a certain type of talent, a certain level of talent at quarterback, but it also has to be someone who fits in with your culture. And if he doesn't feel like any of these guys are it, then I totally get it, So I think there's a number of different ways they could go this offseason. And would it shock me at all if Tyrod Taylor was the starting quarterback in September? It wouldn't shock me one bit. He's already there. He's cheap. They can use resources on the rest of the roster. And again, just build the culture and build it how he wants to in his vision.
Yep. So I think you did a good job sort of like laying out the roster of currently where it's at. But the Jets, to me, are more in a position of less of identifying position needs and more of just I can't wait to sit back and just see how they navigate free agency and the draft for the first time, because it does feel like an extension of what we had with the Detroit Lions, where, you know, they're drafting Jahmyr Gibbs and Sam Laporta and Jack Campbell with like premium picks, and everybody's going, what are you doing? You can't do it like this. And then you just wait a couple of seasons, and then all of a sudden they've got one of the best rosters in the NFL, and you go, oh, okay, I guess that did work out for you. And I feel like Aaron Glenn is going to want to sort of do the exact same thing. Not that he's going to force non-premium positions with premium picks. I'm not saying that, but how they navigate the draft, how they let it come to them. I'm really looking forward to seeing with the New York Jets and breaking that down further. Before we get to the last division, the AFC West, this podcast is brought to you by our friends over at Cherry Bundy, the performance drink that is fueling the Healthlete revolution. If you are an active person at all whatsoever, whether you're training for a marathon, whether you do CrossFit 5 days a week, or whether you just like getting a nice little walk around the neighborhood, this product is for you. Natural products, natural ingredients, no added sugars, those tart cherries that they are made with. It's the highest antioxidant fruit or vegetable in the world, which means it's got all sorts of great benefits. Reduces soreness, increases recovery, naturally occurring melatonin, which helps improve that sleep, and it helps support immunity as well. It's used by nearly 500 collegiate and professional sports teams. Every single NFL team uses it, and it's not just for energy and recovery either. You know, it's stuff that they've got specific products there, whether it's the juices, whether it's the gels, whatever it is, help you sleep. Got extra protein in it. If you're really trying to hit your macros, really trying to hit your protein goals, check it out. Check out all of the great products that they have here for you. Any sort of active lifestyle at all, like I said, you've got to check it out. Products are available over at Amazon. They're available at cherrybunny.com. Retailers nationwide, including like Publix, Kroger, things like that. So go check your local retailers. But if they don't have it there, and if you want to get 20% off, go to cherrybunny.com. Use the promo code PFF20. And whatever your order is, you will get 20% off. So that's only if you're shopping over at cherrybunny.com. Go check out all the great products that they have over there. Help you with sleep, help gives you energy, helps you recover, all that great stuff over at cherrybunny.com. Denver Broncos starting the last AFC division here that we're talking about here today. 31.5 effective cap space, 16th most in the NFL, so right around the middle. Free agents. Linebacker Cody Barton, DJ Jones, defensive lineman, running back Javonte Williams, linebacker Justin Chernod. Jaquan McMillian is also a free agent, but he's an exclusive rights free agent, so he's not going anywhere effectively. That's kind of how that works. So really just the names that I mentioned before him. When you look at the Broncos, looking to take that next step, really played well this year with Bo Nix as a rookie. You're hoping that he takes that next step as well. Some team needs for Denver going in this offseason. What do you got?
I think it's just weaponry, right, on the offensive side. And Sean Payton's talked about this. He just needs more versatile weapons in his offense. I think at running back, at receiver, and at tight end, you feel good about Cortland Sutton being that reliable deep threat. And, you know, Payton can always scheme things, and Bo Nix throws the short passes very well and sets up his receivers for success. But they need more talent at basically all of the weapon spots on their offense, right? So I think they're going to be looking at the draft at running backs, you know, whether that be earlier in the middle rounds. That's going to be a big question. But again, another team with a lot of cap space who needs, especially at that intermediate level, they need some size. They need somebody who can work the middle of the field. They're going to be in on T. Higgins. I think, again, this is it's a huge story because there's so many teams where he would fit in, and Denver's one where he would fit in really, really well. So I think anywhere where they can get more weapons to support Bo Nix on offense is one. And then their one big weakness on defense was at linebacker. So I think that's a spot you could see them looking free agency for somebody like Robert Spillane. You could see them look maybe in rounds 2, 3, and 4 in the draft at some of the linebackers in this class. That's the one spot on defense where they do need to get better. The D-line was really good this year. The secondary was really good this year. Obviously, yeah, the defensive player of the year in Patrick Surtain. That's just the one place. If they fill out that linebacker spot, this could be an elite defense. But I think Sean Payton, and you kind of see it there with the guys that I picked for them as draft targets. Sean Payton a week or two ago talked about he needs jokers, right, in this offense. He needs guys who can create matchup problems and do a lot of different things. And some of those guys that I look at, as those draft targets, Colston Loveland, a tight end, yes, but somebody who can line up anywhere from inline to slot to outside and win, right? A guy like Emeka Ibuka from Ohio State at wide receiver who can motion all the formations throughout the formation and do different things for you. And then even later on, I have Quinshon Judkins down there. He's actually the least maybe versatile of that bunch, but he's certainly a reliable early down back, if not a 3-down back. And then a guy like Brashard Smith, who's a former wide receiver from Miami, maybe the best receiving back in this class. I think Sean Payton wants more versatility in this offense. It's something he's talked about. Find players like he used to have, say, with Alvin Kamara, with Jimmy Graham, with different guys he can move all over the formation and create those matchup problems for opposing defenses, because I think it's something he feels like Denver was missing this past year. And certainly with Bo Nix throwing the ball as accurately as he does, he can get the ball to those spots. They just need the players who are able to expand the playbook for him.
YK in the chat's also saying this could be a potential Deebo Samuel landing spot. You've heard Deebo is sort of up there on the trade market as well from San Francisco if they're moving on from him, which I feel like they are this offseason. Denver's very interesting because then you get a situation where you've got Vele, you've got Marvin Mims Jr., you have Cortland Sutton. Now you're throwing in a Deebo Samuel. Then imagine if they're also able to draft a Cortland Sutton with that Colston Loveland with that first round pick as well. Now you're talking about, wow, that is a diverse group of wide receivers. And then you can even wait a little bit more. You can still get, if that's the case, you can still get yourself a Quinshon Judkins, a Brashard Smith, something like that. So, man, there's a lot of possibilities here for the Denver Broncos. I like some of the free agent targets that you mentioned. I also like what YK is saying in the chat as well, getting a mismatched player like a Deebo Samuel to really put pressure on the defense. I like that for Denver. I'm not going to lie. I have not thought of that before, but I do like that for Denver. The Kansas City Chiefs, they're right around the cap floor. They are $3.6 million effective cap space over the cap, so in the red a little bit there, negative $3.6 million in effective cap space right now. Free agents, Trey Smith's the big one, Nick Bolton's the big one, DeAndre Hopkins as well. Justin Reed, I think, is an underrated free agent here on this team who, if they're not able to bring him back, I think is a damn good football player. Josh Uche, Charles Omenihu, Justin Watson's a free agent as well, Juju Smith-Schuster, Kareem Hunt, DJ Humphries, who I know didn't work out for them, but it's worth noting because they don't have him on the roster anymore. Tershawn Wharton from the defensive line. Like, there are a handful of players here for the Chiefs that, okay, maybe not the Patrick Mahomes, Travis Kelce, Chris Jones type of stars for them, but definitely key role players. And you could make a case that, Trey Smith and Nick Bolton and Justin Reed, losing those three, any combination of them, would be a big blow to how complete that roster is and how well they have played over the last couple of seasons. So what about team needs here for the Kansas City Chiefs there as they bounce back from that Super Bowl loss?
So I think the obvious one is at left tackle, where they really didn't have an answer all year, and by the end of the year they were playing Joe Thuney, their left guard, out there at left tackle. And then right guard with Trey Smith, it sure seems like he's going to be maybe the highest paid offensive lineman this offseason in free agency. It doesn't seem like he's going to be able to stay. So those two spots on the offensive line are huge, and we saw that come up in the Super Bowl when Mahomes just wasn't protected enough, right? And they just couldn't stop that four-man rush from Philly. So pass protection, as it was the last time they lost the Super Bowl to Tampa Bay, it's going to be the big theme this offseason. They don't have to rebuild the whole offensive line like they did that time, but there's two big holes right now on their offensive line. I think they need more explosiveness at running back. I think this is the perfect draft class for them, maybe even on day 2. Go find an explosive player. Their running backs had the least amount of explosive runs in the league this year. Obviously, Isaiah Pacheco was hurt for a lot of it. They're playing Kareem Hunt. They're playing Samaje Perine. They just need somebody with some speed back there to me. I still like Pacheco. I still think he's got a big role on this team, but they need somebody. They've got tough runners. They need somebody who's blazing fast. I think somebody like Travion Henderson from Ohio State, who's got game-changing speed, could help them if they can get him in round 2 or 3. And I think the way I would go about this, I think Nick Bolton's a big guy to keep. Obviously they're not going to be able to keep Trey Smith and Nick Bolton. I think Bolton's more realistic, being that he's at a little bit less of a premium position, but he is the captain of their defense. And then I really think this is the team, if they can clear enough cap space, this is the one that needs to go and get Ronnie Stanley and try to pry him away from Baltimore. I think it would fix everything in pass protection that you need out of your left tackle. He was healthy this year. He had another great season. He's a fantastic pass protector. If they can do that, I think that then sets up, it frees them up from their first round pick from having to take a tackle, maybe somebody like a Josh Connerly, who I mentioned from the Ravens. So it could just be between the Ravens and Chiefs that one of them ends up with Ronnie Stanley and the other ends up with Josh Connerly. That's kind of the scenario I'm putting together in my head right now. But I think that would solve a lot, and then it would allow them in the draft to go, okay, we can find a right guard. We can find more run defense on the D-line. That's a big theme we've had today, and there's plenty of those in the draft. They can take a running back on day 2 without having to worry about what's in front of them. Say if it's a Travion Henderson, if it's a Caleb Johnson, even if it's earlier, if it's a Marion Hampton, something like that. I think it starts with the pass protection, though. The earlier they can fix that, and if Ronnie Stanley could be a primary target for them, and even if that's like their only big free agent signing, you've done everything you've needed to do, because the one goal here now is to protect Patrick Mahomes. You still have weapons. Whether or not Travis Kelce retires is obviously a question, but Xavier Worthy came on in the second half of this year. Rashee Rice is going to be back. Andy Reid always finds ways to get people open, right? I think that's where it would start for me, is who is playing left tackle? I can find interior guys. I'll figure it out. But who's playing left tackle? Who's protecting that blind spot? Because that was really the biggest weakness this year.
No, I agree completely. It's just all about the offensive line for the Kansas City Chiefs. And you could tell Mahomes was not himself in that Super Bowl. And I think that it's because before the game even got kicked off, one of the very few times we've seen Mahomes mentally rattled in his career, and that was before the game even started. I think he watched the Eagles' defensive line on tape. I think he knows the limitations of his own offensive line, and he was rushing everything. He did not trust the guys up front to block for him the way that the way that he knew that they needed to in order to win that game. And because of that, the ball was coming out before it needed to. He was not seeing the field correctly, and he was Sam Darnold seeing ghosts at times. Even when there wasn't pressure, he was feeling like there was pressure, especially in that first half. It was one of the worst halves of football that we've seen from Mahomes in his career. So I think the offensive line, absolutely. I think the Ronnie Stanley call-out's a really good one. If he's going to be anywhere else, definitely could see it being with the Kansas City Chiefs. And if not, yeah, I mean, you're probably talking about an addition somewhere in the late first round. You mentioned Josh Connerly Jr. I'd even consider a guy like Gray Zabel from North Dakota State. At that point, it's just like, okay, well, I need good offensive linemen, because if you don't have either offensive tackle that you could depend on right now, if you think you're probably going to move on, you're not going to be able to bring back Trey Smith, well, then all of a sudden you got two good O linemen, right? All of a sudden, this offensive line for the Chiefs that we felt like was really, really strong, one of the best interiors in the NFL. Now you just got 2 out of the 5. So you got to figure it out, and you got to look at a guy like Gray Zabel from North Dakota State, perhaps even a Donovan Jackson from Ohio State. You get a little bit further, an Ozzie Trapilo, who we talked about before, who I think could be a good option for them. Maybe a little bit later, and Anthony Belton, the Jalen Rivers. So Seth McLaughlin, I know he's coming off injury, but he's playing well for Ohio State before he got injured. Somebody like that. I think offensive line is the big time priority. And then the last thing I'll shout out before we move on, I like the guy that you had in your notes of Calais Campbell as well. If Campbell's going to stick around and he's not going to retire, doesn't feel like Miami can re-sign him. If he wants to go ring chasing, he'd go to Kansas City, and I think that he'd be a welcome addition there for how well he is still playing at an old age and how smart he is along that defensive line, which they love. Las Vegas, I mean, anybody would love, to be honest with you. But Las Vegas Raiders are the next team. $85.7 million in effective cap space. That is second most in the NFL, behind only the New England Patriots. Now, they've got a handful of free agents here. Not backbreaking ones, but ones that could definitely set what their team needs are going to be when we get to draft weekend. I think the 2 that really stand out to me, Trayvon Merrick, Isaiah Polamalu at the safety spot. If you're bringing back one of or none of those guys, then safety all of a sudden becomes a major priority for you. Corner already is, in my opinion, a major priority for them. You also have Nate Hobbs, who is a free agent too, so you have to think about that as well. Robert Spillane, who is a big standout player for them. Divine Diablo, who we were really excited about before he got hurt at the beginning of the year. A couple of other guys, Alexander Madison, Darnay Holmes, Kayvon Chason, John Jenkins, Jordan Meredith along the offensive line, but he's an exclusive rights free agent, so he's not going anywhere. But Dalton, what do you think about this team? Where's the team needs here for you for the Las Vegas Raiders? Yeah,
I mean, there's a ton of them, right? They were dead last in the league in coverage grade. I think it was the worst team coverage grade anybody's had in like 4 or 5 years. That's a spot where I look at in free agency and I go, if there's a team that's going to get to, I think, the top of the secondary market, I think a DJ Reed, corner from the Jets, Javon Holland, safety from Miami, I think that's where it might start. I think about Holland, and they already swiped one Miami Dolphin last year, right, in Christian Wilkins. Wilkins up front. Now you get one on the back end. I think that's where the base has to start for Patrick Graham and this secondary is, look, we have to substantially improve the talent base, right? And I know, again, losing Trayvon Merrick wouldn't help. They could even re-sign him and sign another safety and sign multiple pieces in the secondary, but that would help them raise the floor on their defense a lot because we know when Max Crosby's healthy, they can rush the passer, right? They've got him. They've got Christian Wilkins if he's healthy. We'll see maybe if Malcolm Kuntz is also a free agent. He didn't play at all this year, but he was really coming on in the second half of 2023 and helped them a lot. So I think the back end of that defense for Pete Carroll is going to be a big focus. And then you look on the offensive side of the ball, you have a decent offensive line. You've got Brock Bowers. You got Jacoby Myers. But they need help both at quarterback and at running back, especially. They had the worst rushing grade in the league last year, too. So that's a spot where I start thinking about getting into some theories about that 6th pick in the draft and maybe go, is this the team that ponies up early and takes, say, an Ashton Ginty from Boise State, maybe a potential generational kind of running back prospect that behind a good offensive line, you base this thing around the run game and defense, and if you're going to figure out your franchise quarterback later, if they're going to sign Russell Wilson or Sam Darnold or something like that, this is another team, depending on the move they make at quarterback in free agency, we could know their intentions come draft time too. I think this is another one where you think about if they feel highly enough about a Shedeur Sanders or a Cam Ward. Could they move up to 2? Could they sit at 6 and wait for one of them to drop and wait for those draft night decisions? There's really going to be a lot about this quarterback situation that's shrouded in mystery for the next couple of months. But I think you're talking about top targets too. You think about Ashton Ginty at running back, even a Teteroa McMillan at wide receiver to give him kind of that X guy that complements Jacoby Myers. They have a lot of options here. But I do think improving the coverage, improving the secondary is going to be high on the list for Pete Carroll and Patrick Graham, and then the offense is going to fill out as we get closer to the draft.
Yeah, Pete Carroll knows how to build out a secondary too, so we know that we don't have to worry too much about that. It'll probably be a little bit more of a couple of year vision there for them. By the way, I talked about Devon Diablo. I meant Malcolm Kuntz, when I talked about a guy that they were excited about who got hurt, who we didn't really get to see this year, although Diablo also played well as a pass rusher this past season. But if you're moving on from him, sort of that hybrid player, I like the Nicky Manwari call out there as a safety who could play at the second level. There's a couple of linebackers that they could go with. I do agree with Walt in the chat. Feels like they're going to bring back Robert Spillane, especially for as much money as they have in effective cap space. So feel like they're going to bring him back. You feel like the heart and soul of that defense there in the middle. So I don't think that they really want to lose a player like that. I feel like Mary is another player that they don't really want to lose. But you mentioned, depending on what happens with those safeties, that really tells you how desperate they're going to be when it comes to draft time. So yeah, some safeties, some corners. I think we consistently look at the cornerback position. If the Raiders aren't drafting a quarterback at number 6, it feels like they're probably going with Malachi Starks, Will Johnson, somebody like that. I mean, I guess you could trade down from number 6 as well if you don't love either of those defensive players, get some extra draft picks, pick another corner or a secondary player probably somewhere else in the first round. But that's where I go for this team. Not that it's a complete team yet, but the secondary, you mentioned how bad it was, one of the worst season grades that we've ever given out here at PFF as a team. And so that just has to be so much better this upcoming season. So whether it's making a big splash with a guy like DJ Reed or Javon Holland, or maybe even double dipping. Maybe you're getting DJ Reed and you're signing Will Johnson, or you're drafting Will Johnson. You could absolutely be doing that because it was that poor last year for the Raiders. But those are some of the initial needs as well. Running back, you'll have plenty of time. Now, this is one of the least dynamic running back rooms in the league last year. You'll have plenty of time to get the running back that you need for this team. I think you've got to set up a little bit more of the priority positions before you prioritize getting that dynamic back. That will be more of a complementary piece, in my opinion, over the next maybe 1 or 2 off seasons here for this team, as you got to have to look at it as a little bit more of a long-term project since you made so many changes at general manager with John Spytek coming in there, and obviously with Pete Carroll coming out of retirement as a head coach, but technically didn't retire. He just wasn't a head coach last year. So back under the head coach headset, I should say, for the Raiders, which I am very excited about. Last team that we're talking about is the Los Angeles Chargers. $55.1 million in effective cap space. That's the 6th most in the NFL. Although I will say, if they were to cut Joey Bosa, they get 25 more million on top of that. So that number then would go all the way up to 80, which I think would make them the 3rd highest. Third highest. Yeah, now, that's obviously independent of other teams making other moves, but that would jump them all the way up from sixth most effective cap space to the third most effective cap space in the NFL. But they have a couple of guys that they got to make some decisions on, too. Khalil Mack, Poona Ford, J.K. Dobbins, Elijah Molden, Morgan Fox, and then you get some other players, Christian Fulton, Josh Palmer, Denzel Perryman. Bradley Bozeman's a guy who played almost every snap for them last year along the offensive line. Tier Tart as well along the interior defensive line. So you can bring back a handful of those guys, certainly with as much money as they have, including if they free up some more by moving on from Joey Bosa. But if they move on from Joey Bosa, well, then it feels like edge rusher becomes a massive need for them, even with Tuli Tuipulotu on the team. But edge rusher, I just talked about sort of as one need. What are some other needs here for the Los Angeles Chargers this offseason?
Yeah, I think the defensive line is going to be a big focus, especially in free agency with all those guys you mentioned, especially Mack and Ford, both of whom just had spectacular years last year, Tier Tart too. But they need more weapons aside from Ladd McConkey as well. I think they like where their offensive line is at. Yeah, obviously like having Justin Herbert at quarterback. They just need other productive players. I don't know if they'll bring back Josh Palmer, but even then, that's not a significant improvement on anything they have. Quentin Johnston really hasn't panned out for them the first 2 years, and they got almost nothing out of the tight ends this past year. You know, they were starting Will Dissly, who's not really a dynamic receiving threat. So I think finding more receiving threats, and even players in the backfield. You mentioned Dobbins as a free agent. As the year went on, though, they didn't run the football all that well, and I just think they need something. They need a horseback there, right? And I know they squeezed something out of Dobbins. Gus Edwards was okay for him because he's familiar with Greg Roman and the system and all that. But I think they're another team. I think on day 2 more likely than their first round pick, unless Ashton Jinty were sitting there for any reason. Then I would really think about it. I think on day 2 you're going to see them take a starting caliber running back and really reset this backfield as well.
Who's the back that makes the most sense for this team you like? I see you wrote down Cam Scatterbo. I feel like Jim Harbaugh would have a blast with Cam Scatterbo if he was his back. Is that your favorite target here for the Chargers?
Yeah, I mean, aside from if something crazy were to happen and Ashton Jinty were to fall, I believe, all the way to 22, that's the obvious one for anybody. But no, Scatterbo, the more I looked at it, and part of it I looked into also was the Chargers are kind of a heavy power and gap scheme kind of team, and Scatterbo is really the next best back behind Jinty in that category this year. And he's a very underrated receiver. You know, he's thought of as this power back breaking all these tackles, but he's an underrated receiver who can really give you a two-way threat. And you mentioned it, just feels like Jim Harbaugh's kind of guy, right? Just get out there and run the ball like an absolute psycho. I think Scatterbo, if they were to get him in the second round along with maybe, say a Colston Loveland, a tight end who Harbaugh's familiar with in the first round, or a Luther Burden or a Matt Golden to help them out at receiver, I think that's just the idea as you start filling out this offense, especially as well as Justin Herbert played this year, really with Ladd McConkey as his only legitimate receiver on the outside. There's real potential for this offense to be incredibly dynamic next year if they pick up the right players and they fill in around McConkey, right, and they can continue to work McConkey all over the formation with all the things he can do inside and outside. So I think this is a team I go into this offseason looking at with a boatload of potential, but I think the first step is going to be figuring out what this defensive line looks like in free agency. Again, Khalil Mack, Poona Ford, Tier Tart, these were massive contributors this past year, and if you want to continue to supplement the defensive line in the draft, which Jim Harbaugh is going to do, he's always reinforcing the trenches, getting more depth guys. But I think coming into free agency, that's going to be a story. And again, when you have the money and you need a weapon, T. Higgins is at least going to be a thought. And could you imagine him with Justin Herbert and Ladd McConkey in this offense? And then you go into the draft thinking about Loveland and the running backs and everything that goes around that.
That'd be a lot of fun. I think the Chargers are one of the most fun teams that you could really take a look at this offseason, and they're sort of a ball of clay with all the money that they potentially have, some of the guys in and out of that lineup. You could really change this team and really slingshot this team, which already, I think, played better than expectations for most people last year. And I think everybody looked at the Jim Harbaugh signing. They were like, okay, it's only a matter of time before the Chargers are back on top. And for them to make the playoffs this year, it was really fun to see. And they've got an opportunity to continue to build off of that in a major way. This is a team that does have 11 draft picks. So they could also be a team to move up from number 22, if a top-tier wide receiver, if they don't get a T. Higgins or somebody like that, if a Tetron McMillan has fallen, if a Luther Burden has fallen, and they really want a guy like that, they might be able to pop up a couple of spots there. A couple of people in the chat are asking about Omarion Hampton, because I think Hampton would be a fun fit for this team as well, but for how good of a back he is. Somebody asked, will he be available in the second round? Chargers currently pick at 55 in the second round. I don't know if he makes it to 55, But again, like you could pop up from 55, somewhere in the late 30s, early 40s if Omarion Hampton is still there with one of those picks. Because they have 11 picks, but it's one first-round pick, one second-round, one third-round, one fourth-round, two fifth-rounds, 3 sixth-rounds, and then 2 seventh-rounds. So it's 11 picks, but it's not like it's a ton within the top 100. That's normally how it works. You get more of those picks there a little bit later in the draft with those 3 comp picks that they have. Certainly helps bolster that up to double digits. So the Chargers are going to be a fun team to watch, especially if they move on from Joey Bosa. And then you sort of get into a Joey Bosa saga of, okay, any of the teams that we talked about earlier here in the show, would they be interested in bringing in a veteran like Joey Bosa and taking a chance on him, even though doesn't feel like the same player that he was a couple of years ago. Feels like the injuries are kind of catching up to him. But, maybe a new home, somebody that can use him very well. He becomes, I think, a free agent that you got a note of depending on what happens with the Chargers. There we go. That's all 16 teams in the AFC. Give us some preliminary team needs before the combine, before we get into free agency, and then, of course, before the NFL draft as well. We will be back with you on Wednesday, I believe it is Wednesday, doing the NFC. So we will be rounding everything out, covering every team in the NFL, giving you guys those preliminary needs. So make sure that you're watching out for that episode. For Dalton Wasserman, I'm Trevor Sikkema saying thank you guys so much for watching and listening to the PFF NFL podcast. We'll see you guys on Wednesday.